prices to? Are they going to actually bring in pharmacare, or are they beholden to the pharmaceutical industry? Are they actually going to tackle the problems that's facing climate crisis, or are they beholden to the oil and gas industry, much like the Conservatives are? We're deeply concerned about what this says about the two status quo parties. Donc, ce qu'on a vu aujourd'hui, c'est vraiment un rapport incendiaire. C'est clair que le Premier ministre a fait de pression sur le procureur général, Mme Wilson-Raybould. C'était inapproprié. En fait, ce qu'on a vu, c'est le gouvernement libéral et M. Trudeau veut travailler pour les plus riches.
Mr. Trudeau working for the richest Canadians. They are trying to make life easier for multimillionaires, which means that it's more difficult for everyday Canadians. And that's exactly what we saw with the Conservative government as well. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives are working to facilitate the lives of multimillionaires and make it more difficult for other Canadians.
Should there be legitimate comments associated with a decision like this, or is it enough that the public can make a decision in October on how they feel on this?
I think that the public is certainly going to make a decision about how they feel on this, and they should in the upcoming election. We're proposing a solution, though. What we can do to make sure that no government is in this position in the future is to assure that as soon as any corporation is facing a criminal charge, that they are no longer allowed to lobby with the government. That would be a clear rule, and that's an engagement, that's a commitment that I put in my vision document, that if a corporation is faced with a criminal charge, they're no longer allowed to lobby and meet with the government in that manner. That's just one step we can take, but really, when it comes to this matter, whether we have the Conservatives or Liberals in power, both of them seem to have this track record where they don't get that their job is to work for people, not for the people at the very top. And they're not working for the benefits of everyday families, they're working to make it easier for the multimillionaires, and that's really what I think is at the heart of this matter. Oh, that's exactly it. How do we know that he's not going to do this again? How can he be trusted? Is the question I hope Canadians ask themselves when they're voting on October 21st. How can we believe Mr. Trudeau if he makes any commitment on pharmacare? We believe in pharmacare for all. We're committed to that. But if Mr. Trudeau makes that commitment, how can we believe him? How can we believe he's not going to make a decision that benefits the pharmaceutical industry? If he makes a decision or a commitment on the environment, how do we know he's not going to cave into the demands of the fossil fuel sector? We know right now, we've got proof, we've got evidence that he caved to the demands of SNC-Lavalin, to a powerful corporation, to change the laws to effectively get them off the hook. And how do we know he's not going to do that again? We don't, and that's why I'm asking Canadians to make that consideration when they choose their next elected officials. I think that it's best for people to make a decision that is in their best interest and not one that continues the status quo, which is favoring those at the very top. C'est clair à ce moment qu'on ne peut pas croire le gouvernement libéral, on ne peut pas continuer de croire les libéraux parce que à ce moment avec ce
because right now, with what we have just seen with this report, it is quite obvious that the Liberal government and the Prime Minister are working to make things easier for multimillionaires. And that means it's more difficult for everyday Canadians. How can we believe he will keep his promises in future? We cannot believe a Liberal government, and we cannot believe the Prime Minister. So I am encouraging people to choose a representative who will be working for them like the New Democrats.
So in Hong Kong, we're seeing some really troubling reports of human rights violations. We're seeing people who are dissenting, who are protesting, being treated with very heavy-handed police tactics. This is deeply concerning. What we need to see is that our government is willing to call that out and say this is inappropriate, this is wrong. People should be allowed to voice their concerns, should not have to fear violence from the hands of the state or the police simply because they don't agree with the government policies and are trying to advocate for more democracy.
With what's happening in Hong Kong, I believe the Canadian government should say that what the Chinese government is doing is simply not acceptable. If someone wants to express an opinion or is in disagreement with the government, they have every right to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really clear. This is not just a one-time event. There's an ongoing trend where Mr. Trudeau seems to be working to use his influence and his power, not to help people, but to help those at the very top. Another clear example is the pharmaceutical industry. He made some commitments to reduce the price of medication. He abandoned those commitments after being in government for 4 years. After meeting with the pharmaceutical industry over 600 times, the Liberal government that we know of that's recorded met with the pharmaceutical industry at least 600 times, and they abandoned commitments to reduce the cost of medication. Now they're making that promise again at the eve of an election, the same thing they did in 2015. Again, how do we believe them when we see that they're working to use their influence and power, not to help people, but to help those who are at the very, very top, and that's just wrong. Yeah. Thumbs up all around. We got one more question here, otherwise feel free to take B-roll or do what you gotta do. No problem. Staring off into the distance. Oh yeah, I'm meeting with, that's a great question. I'm meeting with our incredible candidate, local candidate, Laura Collins, city councillor, who's deeply passionate about the environment and making life more equitable. And we're here talking about housing. It's one of the biggest concerns that I hear about when it comes to the upcoming election. When I'm knocking on doors from coast to coast to coast, people are worried about housing. And here in BC, on the island, it's no different. People are really worried about the cost of housing, and we're going to have an announcement about what we would do to solve that problem.
Can I just ask one more, just so I got it on this camera?
Which angle would you like that? Is that good?
However you want to do it. They're so happy with what I did. So talk to me about what you think the repercussions should be out of what the Ethics Commissioner's findings are.
It should be that people should now, first off, I always said we should believe Ms. Wilson-Raybould. People should believe her. It's clear that what she said was right. She was right. She was pressured. It was inappropriate. Contrary to what Mr. Trudeau has been saying, that I have nothing to apologize for. Yes, he does have something to apologize for. The Ethics Commissioner says very clearly he has something to apologize for. He applied inappropriate pressure to benefit a powerful corporation and to help his own re-election, and that is wrong. In addition, I think that voters should use that as some evidence of what's going to happen in the future. How can we trust Mr. Trudeau with any promise moving forward? And that should help people make a better decision on October 21st. Finally, we know that the Conservatives were the mess that the Liberals were trying to clean up. People rejected the Conservatives, and now they're not going to trust the Liberals. I'm asking people to consider maybe it's not a choice between the Liberals and the Conservatives. Maybe they need to look at New Democrats as an option for how we can move forward.
So this could be a positive for your party out of this negative for Canada.
It is absolutely a negative for Canada. I think that we need to highlight that. No one wins when our Prime Minister is found to have violated the Conflict of Interest Act, but I'm certainly asking people to look for it and say they've got the power to change that. They don't have to accept the status quo. They don't have to accept that the Conservatives make a mess, the Liberals try to fix it, and fail miserably. They don't have to go back to the Conservatives. They don't have to be stuck with the Liberals. They have a choice. They can choose a new leader. They can choose someone who's committed to fighting the climate crisis, to tackling the housing crisis, and building a better future. And I'm confident Canadians will make that choice. Thanks so much. Okay, thank you all.
And that is NDP leader Jagmeet Singh reacting to the news that we are following today, that the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau contravened the Conflict of Interest Act over the SNC-Lavalin affair. You'll remember this is when Jody Wilson-Raybould, the former Minister of Justice, former Attorney General of Canada, said that she was inappropriately pressured by the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office, as well as the Chief Clerk of the Privy Council. And the Conflict of Interest Commissioner has now said that, in fact, the Prime Minister did breach that Conflict of Interests Act. We heard from the NDP leader there, who just said that people should believe her. People should believe Jody Wilson-Raybould, that Trudeau should apologize. Trudeau has not apologized to Jody Wilson-Raybould for this whole affair. And then talking politically about the election that is about 10 weeks away, the NDP leader saying that the choice has always been in many people's minds between the Conservatives and the Liberals. Maybe it is time now for people to think about voting for the NDP, that this is a negative for Canada. No one wins when the Prime Minister is found to have contravened the Conflict of Interest Act. The CBC's Janice McGregor joins us live from Ottawa with the details. Also with me in the studio is the CBC's Hannah Thibodeau. So let's start with you, Janice. You've been poring over the report. It's a long one, but there are some very key points in this. So bring us the highlights.
Yeah, good luck, right? 63 pages of fun. Interesting, a few things I will tell people, and you know, by all means, go read it if you can, especially if you sat through all the testimony last winter from the key players we were able to hear from. Some of it is repetitive of that, some of it is consistent with that, but most interesting to me, Mr. Dion interviewed the Prime Minister directly. We never saw a real grilling of Justin Trudeau himself over this. Of course, he'd take questions at different media news conferences and things like that. But to hear the Prime Minister's words on these various points has made for very interesting reading for me so far. But, you know, to remind our viewers, the ultimate conclusion here is that the Prime Minister did contravene the Conflict of Interest Act. I think we have a board of the money quote from the report, which I will read for everyone if you missed it earlier. The Prime Minister directly and through his senior officials used various means to exert influence over Ms. Wilson-Raybould. The authority of the Prime Minister and his office was used to circumvent, undermine, and ultimately attempt to discredit the decision of the Director of Public Prosecutions, as well as the authority of Ms. Wilson-Raybould as the Crown's chief law officer. We've been talking about the impact of the kind of things that you see in this report. There's more than one political career on the line, though, here. A number of key political staffers the opposition wanted to hear from did not testify, in part because Liberal MPs did not agree with calling them as witnesses, but they were interviewed by Mr. Dion for this report. And something that's occurred to me so far that at least I found interesting anyway, it goes through kind of how we got here. The fact that Jody Wilson-Raybould never wanted to change the rules in the first place. Indeed, there's a section where it goes through how she refused to cooperate with the omnibus budget bill that made this provision to have a deferred prosecution agreement, a remediation agreement, even written into Canadian rules. And that, of course, was what SNC-Lavalin wanted to use to avoid a criminal prosecution, and what all these officials were applying pressure to try to get her to kind of reconsider, her department to reconsider intervening to allow this to happen, to make use of this new tool. And there's a particularly interesting thing as pertains to Finance Minister Bill Morneau and his Chief of Staff at the time, Ben Chin. So the budget bill passes in the spring. This new tool is available. It won't take effect, though, until late September. Once it does, SNC-Lavalin is going to be forced to come forward. That's going to be in the middle of the Quebec election campaign. A lot of people, political advisors, very worried about that. And so in August, there are discussions between Ben Chin and Jessica Prince, who was Ms. Wilson-Raybould's Chief of Staff. And this is, now I'm reading from Dion's report. Mr. Chin stated he'd been speaking with SNC-Lavalin and that the company's perception was that the process of negotiating a remediation agreement was taking too long. Now remember, the bill hadn't even taken effect yet, okay? Mr. Chin asked whether anything could be done to expedite the process, and it's clear from the testimony that on various occasions people were told clearly that directing the Director of Public Prosecutions would be inappropriate. And then, this is the part I found interesting, Mr. Chin, of course, he submitted some documents to Mr. Dion, stated that he did not recall what led him to make this inquiry of Jody Wilson-Raybould's Chief of Staff. Now, there were some emails that ensued that were forwarded to Bill Morneau. Bill Morneau was interviewed by Mr. Dion for this report, but his testimony to the Ethics Commissioner was that he doesn't recall reading the email about this conversation. So the report is full of gems. I'm just pulling out one example, perhaps unfairly, but the report is full of examples like this that kind of make you think, that's interesting.
And Janice, I just want to ask you, because I think what you said at the beginning was interesting. So you're saying that a lot of what the Ethics Commissioner is reporting, is revealing to the public today, is based on interviews, conversations, or a conversation he had with the Prime Minister that we're hearing about for the first time, right?
That's right. So the final page of the report was kind of one of the most interesting ones for me to read because it goes through who was interviewed and who submitted documents. And we remember from last spring there was this big conversation about who we really needed to hear from if we were going to properly understand what exactly happened here. And so as I've been reading, I've been watching for when Mr. Dion tells us what Mathieu Bouchard and Elder Marquez, two key officials in the Prime Minister's office, say about their interactions with SNC-Lavalin, about their role in various meetings that we know were very key to this conversation. And it's interesting to kind of get their perspective. They were very cautious in the way they portrayed some of these conversations. You can see efforts by them to slip into their testimony for the ethics commissioner that they understood they weren't supposed to interfere, and they made it clear to the Prime Minister that they understood what the role of the Attorney General was, you know, those sorts of lines. But nevertheless, the fact is, and Mr. Dion is very clear about this in his findings, these officials were speaking to SNC-Lavalin about what SNC-Lavalin wanted done in its case at the same time as they were having these conversations with Jody Wilson-Raybould, with her Chief of Staff, Ms. Prince, and others. And I think when you kind of boil down everything Mr. Dion is parsing here, this is the bit that he is finding sort of is at the heart of the inappropriateness of what was going on, because obviously there's a financial benefit for SNC-Lavalin to avoiding a criminal prosecution. They are framing this in terms of political considerations for the Canadian economy, losing jobs, that sort of thing. But we also know the political context that was made clear in these conversations to Ms. Wilson-Raybould as a member of Trudeau's cabinet, that he was a Montreal MP. You know, there's a Quebec election on, this various testimony that kind of applied that political pressure at various points. So
Janice, just to clarify
fascinating.
That. Yeah, it is. And just to clarify that last point that you just made. So you're saying that Dion, the ethics commissioner, found that the PMO staffers, the two key players in this, were aware that it would be inappropriate to speak to then Justice Minister, then Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould, and chose to anyway.
Well, maybe not exactly like that. So they talk about their preparations for the Prime Minister, for example, before a key September meeting, which, if you remember Ms. Wilson-Raybould's marathon testimony at committee, that conversation became very important in this controversy, particularly how the two individuals left that conversation. They said that when they were preparing the Prime Minister, that they did sort of have very much on their minds the appropriateness and how to proceed on this. But at the same time, elsewhere in the report, at several points, they make it clear that they were kind of surprised that having created this tool to have a remediation agreement, that it wouldn't even be considered or that it wouldn't even be used. And frankly, in that respect, there are aspects of the report that are quite consistent with the testimony we heard from Gerald Butts about this. So I was also finding that part interesting because it kind of shows you kind of an insight into what was on their mind. And indeed, there was one part where this is sort of Trudeau himself talking, but he told Mr. Dion that whatever Ms. Wilson-Raybould would decide, his concern, that being the Prime Minister's concern, was whether this decision could be explained to others in government and to the affected Canadian public. So that ultimately part of what was on their mind was the communications challenge around this. If SNC went down and we lost jobs, what would we do in the middle of an election campaign? What would we do in the next federal election? Sort of that these kind of preoccupations were what was driving them, whereas we know from her testimony, and again it's reinforced in this report, that Wilson-Raybould had a very strict focus on what she felt was proper for her to do and what she felt the Attorney General was and was not allowed to do as far as conversations and any perceived direction of the Director of Public Prosecutions. So I hope that wasn't too complicated.
You know, there's a lot to parse
it's
through.
important to understand the details, because otherwise you are not going to be able to appreciate what the Prime Minister tries to explain, which is coming up soon.
It is, and we will listen. We will hear from him. But Janice, for now, thank you. We're going to continue speaking to you, obviously, throughout the day. But that is the CBC's Janice McGregor. So one of the key questions in this is, how is this going to play out in the court of public opinion? The federal election is less than 70 days away, and Hannah Thibodeau is here with that angle. She is part of our Canada Votes team leading up to the fall ballot. She's obviously a Parliament Hill reporter. We recognize her from that. So having you here is fantastic.
Thanks
on a day like today.
me.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, let's kind of pull back just a little bit. And, you know, because you have been going through this report, and you have found a few areas where the Ethics Commissioner, basically it's the heart of what the Ethics Commissioner has found in terms of finding that the Prime Minister contravened this conflict of interest.
Right, and what this is, he sums it up as essentially as 4 attempts to bend the will of the former Attorney General and Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould. So for the first one, this is where Trudeau, and at the time it was his top bureaucrat, Michael Warnock, who's the guy in charge of all of the cabinet ministers. He has quite a big role. We probably remember his name. They had a meeting with her on September 17th, and they were talking about those job losses you heard Janice talk about, saying that, look, if we can't get this fixed, there could be potential job losses at SNC-Lavalin in Quebec. So that's one of them. And
that's one breach.
That's one. But also included in that meeting is when Trudeau talks about, hey, I am also a Quebec MP. And I don't know if you remember that as well. I have to find the exact part, but these are things. There were also, as Janice
and there could be job losses in my riding, or there could be job losses in Quebec.
Yeah, absolutely. The second one, 2 attempts by senior officials to have Jody Wilson-Raybould intervene in that judicial review. And we just heard from Janice there talking about those senior officials going to her and saying, look, maybe you want to consider this. That is also considered pressure by, inappropriate pressure by the Ethics Commissioner. And the Ethics Commissioner, in the third case, said the Prime Minister's office was pressuring her to seek external advice on the matter. So this is when the Prime Minister's office said, well, maybe you want to get the advice of a former Supreme Court justice on this, and then you could move forward that way. That's another one. But the biggest one, he says, is, remember that phone call that was taped by Jody Wilson-Raybould?
17 minutes or so, yeah.
17 minutes. It was on December 19th with the country's top bureaucrat, Michael Warnock. And in that conversation, he didn't know he was being recorded, but he told Jody Wilson-Raybould that there was rising anxiety over the fate of that major employer. So this isn't the first time he's mentioned that to her. He had the one-on-one meeting. Now this is the phone call. And he also said Justin Trudeau, is quite firm on getting that deferred prosecution agreement. And I think he's going to find a way to get it done one way or another. And throughout that phone call, Jody Wilson-Raybould says, this is really inappropriate. I don't feel comfortable with this. And that's why she says she decided to record that phone call. It happened when she was in Vancouver. She said she didn't have any staff with her, so she felt she had to record it and take proper notes.
This was following a few months of saying that she felt the pressure.
All of the pressure she felt. So in this, the Ethics Commissioner says, I find all of these tactics troubling when referring to trying to bend the will of Jody Wilson-Raybould. And he says the most flagrant attempt to influence her was during that phone call.
All right. You have reached out to Jody Wilson-Raybould. We were going to interview her today.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how she's reacting.
Yeah, we were going to interview her today, and the reason why, she's now running as an independent in Vancouver Granville, and last night the Liberals nominated their candidate to run against her. So we were going to talk a bit about that, but of course she won't be talking today because she says she wants to read the full report. She will get a comment back to us as soon as she goes through that report, but you know, listening to Janice go through everything, it's pretty thick.
Are we expecting to hear from her today?
We may hear from her today. We do have that call into her. She said as soon as she gets through the report, she will get back to us on that.
All right, Hannah, thank you. You'll continue with our coverage throughout the day. There are so many aspects to the story. And if you're just joining us, here is just a reminder of some of the key points from the Ethics Commissioner. The report found the Prime Minister contravened Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest Act. The PM used his authority to circumvent and undermine the public prosecutor's decision. You may recall that was the key choice not to offer SNC a deferred prosecution agreement. And the commissioner found Justin Trudeau and his top officials sought to have the Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould at the time, overrule that decision by the prosecutor. The report also says senior staff would not have acted without knowing the Prime Minister's position on the SNC-Lavalin matter. And the commissioner also stated that partisan political interests were improperly put before the Attorney General for her consideration in the case. I want to bring in Duff Conacher now. He is the co-founder of Democracy Watch and is in Ottawa. Democracy Watch was the first to file an ethics complaint in the SNC-Lavalin case. So Duff, what is your reaction to the Ethics Commissioner's ruling?
The Ethics Commissioner's ruling is good and bad. Good on the Prime Minister, in that he was guilty of violating the ethics law. That's the point and the argument Democracy Watch made in its complaint, and the ruling completely agrees with the complaint that we filed back in February. But bad on the other PMO officials and government officials who participated in pressuring the Attorney General. The Ethics Commissioner says, well, they couldn't have influenced her because they didn't have power over her, and they were acting at the direction of the Prime Minister, and therefore I'm going to let them off the hook. And that's a wrong ruling, and Democracy Watch is considering a court challenge of that part of the ruling.
Okay, so that's interesting. So just unload that a little bit. When you say good on the Prime Minister, good in that the Ethics Commissioner, in your opinion, found that the Prime Minister contravened this section of the Conflict of Interest Act, which you believe to be the case?
Yes, that was the argument we made in our February complaint, that it's improper to pressure the Attorney General because there is this constitutional principle of independence of the Attorney General. You can send information to the Attorney General about the implications of a prosecution, but that's all you can do. And as soon as, through their various spins, Prime Minister Trudeau and Gerald Butts and Michael Wernick and others had this various spins going on, and they arrived at the spin that no inappropriate pressure was put on the Attorney General. And they were actually admitting to wrongdoing when they said that, because no pressure is allowed. So there's no such thing as appropriate pressure. And they put pressure on her, all of them together, and that was improper, and it was furthering SNC-Lavalin's interests, obviously. And that's what the rule says. You can't improperly influence someone's decision to improperly further someone else's interests. That's what they did, and they were clearly guilty, and thankfully the Ethics Commissioner did his job properly and found them guilty.
So the Commissioner found, and I'm just going to read a little bit of this because the words are important, that the Prime Minister contravened Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest Act. He also said, Dion said, I find that Mr. Trudeau used his position of authority over Ms. Wilson-Raybould to seek to influence her decision on whether she should overrule the Director of Public Prosecution's decision not to invite SNC-Lavalin to enter into negotiations towards a remediation agreement. So that is that's the key aspect of all of this.
Yes.
How significant is this finding?
It's a very significant finding. It's lots of evidence in there that raise serious questions now for the RCMP, and they should be, along with the prosecutors that they are consulting, be providing the public with a full public explanation if they decide not to prosecute the Prime Minister for obstruction of justice. Because there is lots of evidence here that points to crossing that line into the crime of obstruction of justice. And there's not, it's not a solid line what obstruction of justice is. There's the case law on it really leaves it as somewhat vague. And so it easily could be seen as a situation that crosses that line. And if they're not going to prosecute the Prime Minister based on the evidence in this report, then they should be providing the public an explanation as to why.
Okay, so Duff, let's just back up a little bit because I think what you're saying is interesting and potentially very damaging to the Prime Minister. Separate for us, if you will, what it means to contravene a Conflict of Interest Act, which is an act of Parliament, versus a criminal obstruction of justice charge.
Right. Well, they're both acts of Parliament. They're both laws. Violating the Conflict of Interest law, that's a federal ethics law, and the only penalty is public shaming based on this report and the political cost of this report and ruling coming out. Because politicians have written this law for themselves, and part of the protection that they put in it was that they wouldn't get any penalties. So Prime Minister Trudeau should be paying at least a significant fine for violating these rules. The Conflict of Interest Act is aimed at preventing corruption by preventing politicians from doing things like furthering people's interests, their own or their family members or relatives or others, improperly. Mr. Trudeau crossed the line, that's what the Ethics Commissioner has found, by improperly furthering SNC-Lavalin's interests. In this case, though, the way he was doing it was trying to influence a prosecution. And that raises the issue of the Criminal Code rule that says you cannot obstruct justice. And that's why we need an explanation from the RCMP and the prosecutors they're consulting as to if they decide not to prosecute Prime Minister Trudeau for obstructing justice, a full explanation as to why they wouldn't do so, given the evidence in this report.
Why? What would you say, and I think we've heard from at least one Liberal strategist so far, we will probably hear this line from the Prime Minister saying, look, all I was doing was having conversations with the Attorney General, trying to protect jobs in Quebec, looking at a different option, at a different this deferred prosecution agreement, at a different option for SNC-Lavalin because there were thousands of jobs that were at stake in the country?
Well, first of all, several reports and investigations looking into the situation have proven that that was a false claim. They really had no reason to believe that the prosecution itself was going to cause some problems for SNC-Lavalin in terms of losing jobs. And that the jobs wouldn't have been lost anyway because it would have been that they've been barred from federal government contracts. And so other companies would be picking up those contracts, and if SNC-Lavalin employees didn't have enough work to do and were laid off, they could have been hired by those other companies.
So why would the Prime Minister
so that's number one.
Why would the Prime Minister risk so much in terms of all of this if it was for, as you're putting it, nothing?
That's a question for him.
Yeah.
SNC-Lavalin had a history of donating a lot to the Liberals, and mainly to the Liberals, including making illegal donations that were returned, as the Commissioner of Canada Elections found. Over a 7-year period, more than $100,000 flowed illegally through executives of SNC-Lavalin and their family members. So maybe that bought enough influence with the Prime Minister to have him stick his neck out on this improperly. Maybe the Prime Minister didn't know that you weren't supposed to influence the Attorney General. That's entirely possible. He's not a lawyer, and maybe no one ever advised him. It sounds like from this report, though, some people were raising the alarm bells, and he was hearing from the Attorney General clearly that this is improper, and there is this doctrine that the Attorney General is supposed to make independent decisions. So I don't know how he could claim at that point that he didn't know. He may not have known when he first started trying to pressure her, but certainly knew after that. I don't know. You have to ask him. It certainly, I don't think, will end up being worth it, given the political cost, including the possibility of being prosecuted for obstruction of justice, which will be not just a political cost, but will result in possibly a conviction under the Criminal Code. Very serious, of course, for a Prime Minister to even face charges, let alone a conviction.
Duff, good of you to take the time today. Thank you. Duff Conacher.
Thank you very much.
Is the co-founder of Democracy Watch. We are expecting We're going to briefly tell you about some other news today. It's early morning in Hong Kong right now, and the city is quiet, but just a few hours ago, the streets saw another flare-up. Protesters had gathered outside a police station to protest what they say is police brutality. Some demonstrators aimed laser pointers at the building. Police used tear gas to drive the crowd away. It was the first incident since an outbreak of violence yesterday at the Hong Kong International Airport. There are still some protesters there, but they are restricted to a small area and flights have resumed. Violet Law can take us through the developments. She's a freelance journalist in Hong Kong. So, Violet, what's the degree of support the protesters have among the population of Hong Kong?
Well, I would say it has remained strong and the support is broadening. Like every time when police unleash tear gas in different neighborhoods, hitting not just the protesters, but also bystanders and local residents, people get angry. So more and more people are coming out. And meanwhile, ironically, the movement has been sustained more by how tone-deaf top officials have been. So far, they have refused to even acknowledge some of the people might have legitimate complaints about police misconduct. And all the while, they have been defending the police time and again at press conferences, and there have been many, at least one a day. So basically, they have been just closing ranks against the protesters, and this has gotten even more people angrier.
What would it take for people to stop their protests?
Well, it's actually not that hard. There are 5 demands, but if only, say, the government would set up an independent panel to look into police conduct, that would actually would make a good segment of the protest movement happy. Or they can also, formally withdraw the extradition bill, which is the start of all 9 weeks of protest, instead of just calling it is dead, meaning it's been put aside, meaning it may well be brought back to Legislative Council. Or if Chief Executive Carrie Lam would resign, I think that would actually make a really, a large segment of the protest movement very happy. But, unfortunately, none of these is likely to happen, because for any of these to happen, then Hong Kong and Beijing, by extension, would be conceding to what they are now calling early signs of terrorism.
How concerning is it to people in Hong Kong that there appears to be troops, at the border of the territory?
It has been reported a couple weeks ago. But to be honest, the police force here has been trained as a paramilitary force for half a century. They have at their disposal a lot of weapons. And just 2 days ago, they demonstrated the use of anti-riot water truck in front of a group of legislators. So it's reasonable to assume they plan to deploy these vehicles pretty soon, on top of the rubber bullets, sponge bullets, tear gas that they have been unleashing upon not just protesters, as I said before, but also bystanders and local residents.
Violet, thank you. That is Violet Law in Hong Kong.
Thank you, Andrew.
A reminder now of the breaking news this hour. Canada's Ethics Commissioner has released his report on the SNC-Lavalin affair and finds fault with the Prime Minister. Mario Dion says Justin Trudeau broke the conflict of interest rules by using his authority over former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould. He says Trudeau used his position to pressure Wilson-Raybould to stop a criminal prosecution of the Montreal engineering giant. So, how is this going to play out with voters? The federal election is less than 70 days away. Hannah Thibodeau is working on that aspect of the story. She's part of our Canada Votes team leading up to the fall ballot. So, Hannah, does today's report change things?
I think it does. If you looked at the polls back in April when this whole saga began and continued to unfold, you could see that there was a lot of bleeding in the numbers from the Liberal Party. The polling numbers started to drop. They fell behind the Conservatives when it came to that. And then over the last little bit, when the story kind of died away, then they started to pick up steam again. And it looked like the numbers were starting to go back in favor for the Liberals. However, when you get a situation like this, remember, just less than 10 weeks from now is the federal election. This is going to be the chance for Canadians to ultimately decide, is this something that affects them when they cast their ballot? This type of breach of ethics when it comes to the Prime Minister. So it's going to be interesting to see. And yes, when you look at all of the other leaders, they are ensuring that in this pre-election period, they make this an election issue. And
we should let our viewers know that moments from now, we are expecting Conservative leader Andrew Scheer to go up to that microphone in Regina in Saskatchewan. He is going to speak. We also should let our viewers know that at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we are expecting to hear from the Prime Minister. Pretty much guaranteed just about every question will be about this. Yes.
And when it comes to Andrew Scheer, too, I think one of the things we are going to hear him call for again, and you heard it from Duff Conacher there, that there should be an RCMP investigation. We heard previously that Andrew Scheer called for this, and I think that's what we expect him to again repeat today, because now the Ethics Commissioner has come out with this report.
And what's interesting about that is that we don't know if the RCMP is investigating or not. And Duff Conacher is basically saying, all right, he thinks we should know if they are investigating or not. And if they're not, explain. If they are, explain. You know, he's part of the group Democracy Watch.
They never confirm or deny if there is an investigation. And one of the other things, too, when it comes to this, you know that now Mario Dion has found the Prime Minister in breach of this. So what is the penalty for it? There is no fine for the Prime Minister, and that might be interesting to some. The Conflict of Interest Act does not provide for the imposition of sanctions for contraventions following an examination conducted by the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, Mario Dion. The only penalties under the Act are administrative monetary penalties, which the Commissioner can impose, but in this case, they say these penalties do not apply. So no financial penalties. I think what we're watching for is that this happening in this pre-election campaign time, and then how it will play out in the campaign of public opinion.
We'll watch for that. Hannah, thank you. And sorry, I've just this is what we're looking at. We are looking at live pictures of Regina, where the Conservative Party leader, Andrew Scheer, as I've been saying, will be making a statement following this breaking news into the SNC-Lavalin affair. Canadian Ethics Commissioner ruled that Trudeau broke the Conflict of Interest Act, and any moment now, as we've been talking about, Andrew Scheer will give his reaction live. Stay with CBC as we continue to follow this story. And Hannah is here with me. So we've heard from the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh.
We've heard from Scheer already as well.
Right.
Yeah, he did tweet. So this is what, this is essentially what we are going to hear from him there. Like I was mentioning, he has previously asked for an RCMP investigation into this. And I'm just looking for his tweet here, too. He did tweet out something essentially saying that, they're not happy with this. They go on to say...
The only Prime Minister to break the Conflict of Interest Act, not once but twice.
They said that, they go on to say that he should be ethical and accountable, and Andrew Scheer in this tweet says he used the power of office to reward his supporters, punish his critics. And he goes on to say he's now the only PM in history to be found guilty of breaking federal ethics law, not once, but twice. And this is the second time, yes. This first time was when he went to the Aga Khan's Island, and the ethics commissioner at the time was Mary Dawson. And Dawson found that Trudeau's visit to the island, that he was getting aboard a private helicopter, broke sanctions of the Conflict of Interest Act at that, because it prohibits a minister or any member of their family from accepting gifts or advantages that could reasonably be seen as influencing government decisions. And also, Trudeau didn't properly recuse himself at the time from 2 occasions from private meetings about the Aga Khan's $15 million grant to the Center for Global Center for Pluralism. So that was the first time. This is the second time, and it's the only time a prime minister has been found guilty or in conflict of the ethics code.
Let's talk a little bit about what Jagmeet Singh had to say. He said people should believe her, as in Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Well, there was a lot of back and forth at the time. It's like, well, is she angry because she was doing what she wanted and this is an HR issue where the prime minister said you go do this and she didn't want to? Or was this inappropriate pressure? So that was one of the questions, and it was a debate that was happening all throughout the internet as well.
And also, Hannah, the NDP leader saying that Justin Trudeau should apologize because Justin Trudeau has not apologized to Jody Wilson-Raybould over all of this. He says there was a problem in communications, that they could have done things better, but in terms of saying, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done this, he has not done that.
He has not done that. He hasn't said sorry to her. I think he probably has, I'm trying to remember the exact words, he regret how it unfolded and things could have been done differently, but there was never the word sorry in there. It'll be interesting to see if that question is asked of the Prime Minister. Does he apologize to her? Because remember, she was a cabinet minister. She was one of the highest ranking cabinet ministers in the Canadian government. She was both the Attorney General and Justice Minister. She was then moved to the portfolio of Veterans Affairs, and she said at the time she took the Prime Minister's word for the move over to Veterans Affairs, that it didn't have anything to do with the SNC-Lavalin case. But then she said, I reflected on that and realized that when the Prime Minister stood out there and said that she stood behind him, and this was at a press conference in BC, she said, hold on, no more. So she stepped down as Veterans Affairs Minister. And then her and Jane Philpott, the other cabinet minister who was involved in this and backed Jody Wilson-Raybould, got booted from the Liberal caucus by the Prime Minister. So will the word sorry come out of his mouth? That is a very good question.
It is a good question because the Prime Minister up to this point basically has said, look, again, we could have done things differently, but that he didn't believe that he had done anything wrong. You apologize when you've done something wrong.
Yeah.
Now you've got a conflict of interest commissioner, an ethics commissioner rather, coming out and saying, you did something wrong. So it'll be interesting to see if that apology now happens in a way that it has not happened over the 6, 7, 8 months of all of this.
Because there were a lot of repercussions for those 2 women who were directly involved in this too. And will he feel that he needs to apologize? But there's also a lot of repercussions, maybe potentially when it comes to him as well. And as we were talking about, we are 10 weeks away from the federal election campaign. They still haven't decided when the writ will officially drop. Will it be a longer campaign? Will it be a shorter campaign? That may come into play in their minds now. Do they need more time? We know it's going to happen on October 21st, but will the writ be dropped, the week of the long weekend? Will it be the week after? Will they keep it a bit shorter, a bit longer? That'll be something that's interesting to keep an eye on as well.
The other thing was we knew that the Ethics Commissioner was investigating this, but I think it caught some of us a little bit by surprise that this report came out today.
I would say yes. And the only reason for that is yesterday at a press conference, the Prime Minister was asked a question because we know that former Justice Minister Anne McClellan was doing a report for the Prime Minister as to whether the role of the Attorney General and Justice Minister should be separate, like they have in other countries. He was asked whether he was going to release that report, and his response was, I'm not releasing it until after the ethics report comes out. So it doesn't sound like he knew that that was going to happen today. And they typically don't get a heads up when these types of reports come down, but this hit like a bombshell today, and it will be interesting to see his reaction. And in fact, watching his body language and how nervous he feels about this.
This is interesting. All right, Hannah, hold on, stay there. We're going to continue our discussion here, but if you're just joining us, here is a reminder of some of the key points from the Ethics Commissioner. The report found the Prime Minister contravened Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest Act. The PM used his authority to circumvent and undermine the public prosecutor's decision. You may remember that SNC seemed to be heading to court, and the commissioner found Justin Trudeau and his top officials sought to have the Attorney General overrule that decision by the prosecutor. The report also says senior staff would not have acted without knowing the Prime Minister's position over the SNC-Lavalin matter. And the commissioner also stated that partisan political interests were improperly put before the Attorney General for her consideration in the case. And these are live pictures of Regina, where the Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer is going to be making a statement following this breaking news into the SNC-Lavalin affair. It was expected to start at 1:30. We should be hearing from Andrew Scheer any moment now. Again, the Canadian Ethics Commissioner ruled that Trudeau broke the Conflict of Interest Act. We have heard from Andrew Scheer on Twitter, reacting, online, but we are expecting him to make some remarks and probably take some reporters' questions. We will bring that to you live as soon as that happens. We're also going to hear from the Prime Minister himself. That is expected at 2 p.m. Eastern, so in about 15 minutes from now. We'll definitely take that live as well. So for more on this story, I want to bring in Tracy Ramsey. She's an NDP MP and Vice Chair of the Justice Committee. And here in studio, we have former Conservative Cabinet Minister Peter MacKay and our very own Hannah Thibodeau of Canada Votes. Tracy, I just want to start with you. What was your reaction to seeing the Ethics Commissioner's finding that the Prime Minister contravened the Conflict of Interest Act over the SNC-Lavalin affair?
Well, this is a bombshell. I mean, the Prime Minister has been for months now maintaining that he did nothing wrong, that there was nothing to see here. Let's just wait until the Ethics Commissioner comes with their report. So this report today tells Canadians exactly what the NDP has been saying all along, that the Prime Minister was not being truthful, and that we now know that he broke the law and he politically interfered in the decision of the Attorney General of Canada. And not only that, but smeared Miss Wilson-Raybould all the way as he was going through this, really kicked herself, kicked other members out of caucus, Jane Philpott out of caucus. This has just been, from the Liberals, an attempt to keep the truth from Canadians, whether that was in the Justice Committee or now we see in this report that the Ethics Commissioner is saying that they were keeping things from the Ethics Commissioner. They weren't even providing all of the information there for the Ethics Commissioner to do a full report. This is disturbing. If Canadians want Liberals, you're going to get corruption, because that's what it's going to equal this fall in the election. And this report clearly states the many, many ways that he inappropriately pressured the Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, and some other very disturbing elements coming out about the fact that, again, they're trying to keep the truth from Canadians. This report, I don't know how Canadians are going to see this and, not fully understand now that he broke the law, number one, that he inappropriately pressured, and that he did not tell the truth to Canadians. He was trying to keep this under wraps.
Sorry to interrupt, Tracy Ramsey. We're going to take you now live to Regina, where Conservative leader Andrew Scheer is reacting. Let's listen.
Today's verdict is in, and it is a guilty verdict. Justin Trudeau is guilty again. Heading into this election, Trudeau has already become the only Prime Minister in Canadian history to have been found guilty of breaking ethics laws. Now, we know he's done it again. Earlier today, and for the second time in just 4 years, the Ethics Commissioner has found Trudeau guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act in connection with his role in the SNC-Lavalin corruption trial. And today, Justin Trudeau has been found guilty of illegally interfering to block the fraud and bribery trial of a Liberal-linked corporation. Now, his first violation for accepting a paid vacation on a luxury island from someone lobbying his government was shocking. This one is unforgivable. The company, which had given $100,000 in illegal donations to the Liberal Party itself, is on its own charged with defrauding some of the poorest people on earth of over $100 million. And what we have now is a clear picture of who Justin Trudeau truly is, and it's not who he promised he would be. He promised he would be accountable and ethical. Instead, time and time again, he has used the power of his office to enrich himself, reward his friends and punish his critics. As the Ethics Commissioner notes in his report, quote, "The authority of the Prime Minister and his office was used to circumvent, undermine, and ultimately discredit Jody Wilson-Raybould. He promised he would be open and honest. But let's remember, on the day that this story first broke, Justin Trudeau denied it completely. He said that the story was false. He then said that he never pressured Jody Wilson-Raybould. We now know that is false. He also said that she never came to him with her concerns. Again, we now know that was false. And he said that he would be happy to work and cooperate with the Ethics Commissioner, and now we know that is false as well. He promised he would be different. Instead, we now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Justin Trudeau is not as advertised. He has stated so many falsehoods that no one can believe anything he says. Now, Trudeau may never face a court of law for his role in this scandal, but he will have to face the Canadian people over the next few weeks. And on the eve of this election, the choice before Canadians has never been more clear. Between a Prime Minister who abuses his power, bends the law for his friends, attempts to silence his critics, and destroys their reputation, and a Conservative government led by a Prime Minister who will uphold the rule of law, respect our democratic institutions, and help all Canadians get ahead. Justin Trudeau est coupable une fois de plus.
Once again, Justin Trudeau is guilty. Before this election, Justin Trudeau was the only Prime Minister of Canada in the history of Canada to have been found guilty of breaking ethics laws. And he started again. Today, for the second time, in only 4 years, the Ethics Commissioner has found Prime Minister Trudeau guilty of contravening the Conflict of Interest Act in relation to the SNC corruption trial. His first mistake was to accept a paid vacation on a luxury island, and that was shocking. This second one is absolutely unpardonable. We now see who this Prime Minister is, and this is not the person he promised he'd be. He promised to be accountable and ethical, but again and again he used the power of his office to enrich people, reward others, and punish others again. As the Ethics Commissioner states in his report, the authority of the Prime Minister was used to circumvent, undermine, and discredit Jody Wilson-Raybould. He promised to be all open and honest. But the day when this scandal broke in the Globe and Mail, he said it was false. And he spent 2 months saying that things, that it was not true, and continued to say falsehoods to Canadians, stating he had not pressured Ms. Wilson-Raybould. He had promised to be different, but we now know, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that Justin Trudeau is not as advertised. He may never face a court of law. However, he will have to face the people of Canada in the next few weeks. And before this election, Canadians' choice has never been clearer now. Between a Prime Minister who abuses his power and bends the law for his friends, in the process silencing his critics, and a Prime Minister who will uphold the rule of law and respect our democratic institutions and help all Canadians to improve their daily lives. Thank you very much.
Questions now.
Mr. Scheer, do you think that the Ethics Commissioner's findings will be enough to potentially justify an obstruction of justice investigation?
I certainly believe that there is enough evidence here to warrant an RCMP investigation. Justin Trudeau has attempted to distract this scandal from Canadians. He has used the power of his office to shut down multiple parliamentary investigations. We now know from the Ethics Commissioner's report that there were several key witnesses who were unable to testify to the Ethics Commissioner because Justin Trudeau blocked that from happening. So I certainly do believe that there is enough here to warrant a further investigation by the RCMP.
I just want to ask, there was a finding here that the lack of action to waive cabinet confidences impeded the investigation by the Ethics Commissioner. What do you call on the PCO and the government to do to resolve that situation?
Well, we called from the very beginning for Justin Trudeau to waive full to grant a full waiver of confidentiality. Remember, he tried to convince people that he had lifted the veil on this by having a very selective waiver, only allowing Jody Wilson-Raybould and others to talk about a very narrow part of this scandal. We now know today that there were other witnesses who had relevant information who were prevented from speaking because Trudeau refused to grant that full and complete waiver. So I would renew my call today for that to happen. If Justin Trudeau believes that he did nothing wrong, if he believes that he has nothing to hide, he should let the light of day shine upon this entire scandal.
Presuming that Justin Trudeau, earlier this week, Trudeau said that he's committed to releasing the report by Anne McClellan once this report was out, presuming that's going to happen. Given Dion's conclusion, how much credence should Canadians give that second report from the former Liberal cabinet minister?
Well, I was never prepared to give that report any credence. Justin Trudeau asked a former Liberal from a government that was responsible for the sponsorship scandal to investigate his handling of the SNC-Lavalin scandal. So I don't believe that Canadians are interested in the findings of Liberals who investigate other Liberals. This report by an independent officer of Parliament carries much more weight, and so that's I made my statement today drawing on the conclusions from this investigation by this officer of Parliament.
Earlier this year, you called for Justin Trudeau to resign. Do you still think that's true?
Well, at this point, Justin Trudeau needs to be defeated. And Canadians will have that opportunity on October 21st.
Why did you change your position, though?
Well, he clearly put his own partisan interests ahead of the democratic institutions that have served this country so well for over 150 years. He made the decision to stay in office. Now the decision is in the hands of Canadians on October 21st, and I believe that Canadians will make the right choice to get rid of a scandal-plagued Prime Minister who uses the power of his office to silence his critics and reward his friends, and a Conservative government led by a Prime Minister who will uphold the rule of law and respect our democratic institutions.
If a Prime Minister is found to be in violation of something like this, what do you think is the correct response?
Well, at this point in our parliamentary cycle, the correct response is for Canadians to vote out a corrupt Liberal government led by a Prime Minister who still cannot accept responsibility for his actions. Canadians will have that opportunity on October 21st, and I'm certainly excited about the prospect of putting forward our plan to restore integrity to Canada's government and to make sure that we are a government that's working for all Canadians. Justin Trudeau is using his office to help a very select group of his very rich and powerful friends. That's not who the government of Canada should be working for. And a Conservative government will help all Canadians get ahead.
What do you think is the correct response from the Prime Minister, though?
Well, he should begin by accepting responsibility. He still has failed to do that. But again, he refused to step down when these findings were first put forward to Parliament, when we had sworn testimony at the Justice Committee by Jody Wilson-Raybould that proved that what Justin Trudeau said was false and that he knew it was false. And he refused to take responsibility for his actions then. I don't expect him to do that today, but Canadians can hold him responsible on October 21st.
In a situation like this, you would feel that stepping down would be the correct thing for a Prime Minister to do?
I think any time a Prime Minister is found guilty of breaking these types of rules, that they need to take responsibility. I made the call months ago when it was clear that Justin Trudeau told things to Canadians that were clearly not true, when he was using the power of his office to shut down independent investigations. I made the call on him to step down then, to do the right thing, because he had lost the moral authority to govern. This report proves that beyond a shadow of a doubt. I don't expect him to do the right thing, but I know that Canadians have the opportunity to hold him responsible on October 21st.
You went as far as to say today that you believe that he's used his office to, personally enrich himself. I didn't see anything to that effect in this report. Can you just explain how you came to make those allegations?
Well, first of all, obviously, when he accepted the illegal gift, that was a personal benefit to him. This is in his conversations with Jody Wilson-Raybould, he talks about his own seat being at risk, putting his own personal ambitions and his own personal interests ahead of the independence of our rule of law. And again, the focus there is being that he has interfered in a criminal investigation to further his own partisan interests, his own personal interests in his capacity, and of course the other accepting of illegal gifts prior to this report certainly show that he has a pattern of breaking these types of laws.
That, if you become Prime Minister, you'll restore integrity to the office. If a member of your caucus were to break ethics commissioner rules, what would your course of action be? Would they be expelled from caucus if they were found guilty?
Obviously, we're going to hold ourselves to a very high account when it comes to integrity and ethics. I expect all members of my team to follow those rules, and I can assure you that neither myself nor anyone in our government will use the power of their office to interfere in independent prosecutorial decisions. This is what this whole question is about. We have a company that's facing serious corruption charges for defrauding some of the world's poorest people. And when they are being held accountable in Canadian courts, they lean on Justin Trudeau and their friends in the Prime Minister's office to interfere, to get a special deal. That's to get the trial stopped. That is an unforgivable assault on the independence of our rule of law and the independence of our justice system. And that is why Justin Trudeau needs to be held accountable, and I'm confident that Canadians will do exactly that.
But what would happen to Conservative MPs if they were to break ethics rules? We talked a lot about Justin Trudeau that would not. What did Andrew Scheer do?
Well, obviously, look, this is a Liberal Party problem. This is a Liberal government, a Liberal Party that has never in its history been able to tell the difference between when the Liberal Party of Canada stops and the government of Canada that's meant to govern for all Canadians starts. That is what we're talking about here. Of course, in the future Parliament, under a Conservative government, all members of Parliament will be expected to live up to the very highest standards of ethics and accountability. And I will certainly ensure that that happens.
Given the fact that Canadians go to the polls in October, do you believe that this matter needs to be investigated any further?
So absolutely, I just asked a question on whether or not the RCMP should look into that. I do believe that that is appropriate. We called on that to happen at the time that these allegations were first brought up. We'll be looking at what our options are in the coming days, and we'll have more to say on that in the near future.
Mr. Scheer, do you think that Canadians are invested enough in this issue for this to be a key point of the fall federal election?
I do. I do believe that Canadians care about their justice system. I do believe that Canadians care when they see people in powerful offices abusing that power to further their own narrow self-interests and to undermine one of the pillars of our democratic institutions. Canadians understand that we have to be very vigilant against those who want to abuse the power of their office and engage in this type of corrupt behavior. And I do believe that this will be top of mind for Canadian voters this election.
What more do Canadians need to learn about this matter if you still believe it needs to be investigated?
Well, we need to know the full details. Jody Wilson-Raybould has already said multiple times that there's more that she would like to say, but can't because that full waiver was not granted. We need to know what she would add to this. We know that there were multiple people who the Ethics Commissioner attempted to contact, and they were prevented from testifying. We need to know what they would say. The fact that Justin Trudeau is going to such great lengths to cover up, to block investigations, to cancel inquiries into this matter tells me and tells all Canadians that there is more to this story that they need to know.
Mr. Scheer, if you win the election, will you separate the Attorney General role from the Justice Minister?
This is not a problem of which other roles Jody Wilson-Raybould had. In order to prevent this from happening in the future, we need to replace this Prime Minister. Justin Trudeau bullied the Attorney General. It doesn't matter what other titles the Attorney General had. He was speaking to Jody Wilson-Raybould in her capacity as the Attorney General because she had the power to intervene in this criminal prosecution. That is the essence of this problem. And Justin Trudeau may try to say later on today or in the days that come that this was the result of some kind of structural problem in the cabinet, in the Prime Minister's office. That is completely false. The structural problem was that Justin Trudeau attempted to interfere in a criminal prosecution. That would have happened no matter what type of dynamic existed with what other roles the Attorney General had. So again, the focus here is the way that Justin Trudeau bullied, attempted to interfere, and then denied so blatantly, saying things that were so blatantly untrue to Canadians for weeks and months at a time. And knowing that the truth would eventually come out, it's so disappointing to see a Prime Minister desperately attempt to cling to power by saying so many falsehoods. We just can't believe anything this guy says anymore. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, everyone.
And that is Conservative leader Andrew Scheer responding to the Ethics Commissioner's report that was released just a couple of hours ago, in which Mario Dion found the Prime Minister to be in contravention of the Conflict of Interest Act over the whole SNC-Lavalin affair, in which you'll remember in the fall there were allegations by the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould that the Prime Minister and his office and the clerk of the Privy Council inappropriately pressured her to interfere in a case, a prosecution against the Montreal engineering giant SNC-Lavalin. Andrew Scheer saying that this is the first time that a Canadian Prime Minister has been found not once but twice to be in contravention of this of these ethics, and saying that the first one was related to that trip to the Aga Khan's island in the Caribbean over the Christmas holidays a few years ago. That was shocking, but this breach is unforgivable. Janice McGregor is joining me and has more on all of this. So Janice, what's your big takeaway from what Andrew Scheer had to say?
I found it interesting, Andrew, his use of a lot of words that we would see in a court of law. Guilty, a guilty verdict again from the Ethics Commissioner. Of course, that's not what the Ethics Commissioner sets out. This isn't about a criminal prosecution, but wanting to kind of establish in the public's mind, using a word like that, I thought was an interesting communications choice on the part of the Conservative leader. You heard him say things like he may never face the court of law, but he will have to face the voters this fall, really working with that analogy. Then later in the news conference, Mr. Scheer asked kind of one of the questions of the moment, which is whether he believes there's enough evidence to warrant an investigation of obstruction of justice. I'm having trouble saying that word, sorry. Then it would be a criminal matter if it met that bar. Scheer's saying that in his opinion, yes, there is enough evidence. Of course, we have heard Conservatives saying that all along. They started making this point earlier this spring, as far as we know. As Hannah's been telling you, the RCMP never tells us whether they're investigating anything or not. As far as we know, though, that is not going forward or has not gone forward yet. But yeah, that was what struck me more, the framing of this, keeping in mind that everybody's going to the voters this fall. And
Janice, just one other point. Andrew Scheer had been calling on the Prime Minister to resign. Now, we're 10 weeks away from an election. Now he says he should be defeated on October 21st. So that's a different
and that is the challenge for the Conservative team, right? That is the challenge ahead of them. They need to make that case every day of the election campaign to come. This report from Mr. Dion, now a big weapon in the hands of the Conservative Party as they go to the people to make that case.
All right, Janice, thank you. The CBC's Janice McGregor following this all day with us from Ottawa. For more on the story, I want to bring in Tracy Ramsey. She's an NDP MP and Vice Chair of the Justice Committee. And here in studio, we have former Conservative Cabinet Minister Peter MacKay and our very own Hannah Thibodeau of Canada Votes. Welcome to you all. And Tracy, we spoke with you just before we heard from the Conservative leader. And Hannah, we've been watching along with Peter MacKay here in the studio.
I think one of the big things, and Janice was talking about it there, I want to bring in Peter MacKay, who's a former Attorney General and Justice Minister, also a former Conservative Cabinet Minister, just to keep everything in perspective here. But we were talking about the fact that Andrew Scheer is saying, look, there should be an RCMP investigation, and you are one of the former attorneys general who also wrote to the RCMP asking for this. What would the charge be, and can you see the likelihood of this happening?
So it would be under Section 139 of the Criminal Code. It would be obstruction of justice. And keep in mind that the bar for an investigation by the RCMP and the laying of a charge is different than what a prosecutor would examine or what a judge and a jury properly instructed. So it's balance of probabilities, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We do have more evidence now as a result of this investigation, and reason to believe that there could be more evidence still because of what Mario Dion said, in that he didn't get full disclosure from all of the witnesses, all of the cabinet ministers and others, Clerk of Privy Council. And so there is reason to suspect there could be more evidence out there. But there is certainly evidence as a result of the conviction, if you will, under this federal law, Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Act, that says there was inappropriate pressure applied, that there was an effort to bring about personal gain on the part of SNC-Lavalin. Some could go further and say personal gain on the part of the Prime Minister, and that came out at Andrew Scheer's press availability. Well,
are you talking about re-election there?
Absolutely. I'm talking about...
Because he's a Quebec MP.
Correct. The avoidance of further scrutiny, the avoidance of the fallout from what we now see as a big political scandal. And so it's arguable that there was advantage to him that this issue go away, that the deferred prosecution agreement be granted, that SNC-Lavalin essentially is off the hook to a large degree. And so, let's not forget some of those fateful words of Gerald Butts, who said there is no solution without interference. And a lot of the evidence, I think, and those members of the Parliamentary Justice Committee, that they were trying to adduce more and more evidence, that wasn't really the type of evidence that you would get in a court of law where you would be compelled to answer. It's not the type of evidence you would get if you had subpoenas, for example, to get emails, to get letters, to get exchanges of information that weren't available. And the last thing I'll say is perhaps the most damning evidence in all of this that we know so far on the public record was the ill-fated phone call between the Clerk of the Privy Council and Jody Wilson-Raybould, where it was apparent in tone and in terms of what was going on that she was feeling pressure, that she very much felt intimidated and that she could lose her job. And guess what? She did.
And going through, sorry about that, and just going through Mario Dion's points there and attempts to bend the will of Jody Wilson-Raybould in this report, the phone call you're talking about, he says that was, quote, the most flagrant attempt to influence her.
So, Tracy Ramsey, I just want to bring you in here and ask you, do you think that this warrants an RCMP investigation? Is there did the Prime Minister potentially obstruct justice?
I mean, we'll leave that up to the RCMP. We don't want to interfere and as parliamentarians try to direct the work of the RCMP, but I would imagine that they're looking at this evidence today and they're looking at whether or not they're going to bring charges. But to be honest, we wouldn't even have this report without the NDP, without the work of the complaint that was filed by Charlie Angus and by Nathan Cullen. That's the result. This report came out of that, and that's because of the extreme frustration. The Liberals shut down the Justice Committee, would not allow any further testimony. They only allowed Jody Wilson-Raybould a small window of testimony of time. They did everything possible to stop what the report came out today from saying that what he had done was illegal. What he has done is broken the law. They really have tried at every turn to deflect away from this, to make sure that this truth would never see the light of day. And I'm really proud of the NDP and this complaint now coming forward with the truth for Canadians, which they deserve. And that's what we've been fighting for all along, is that truth to come out. And if we want to talk about the party that's going to stand up for people over corporations, now we know the Liberal Party will never do that. This is, at the root of this, is them going to bat for a corporation over the interests of people and going to the extreme of politically interfering in the Attorney General's business. So we know that they're willing to do that. People know that the Conservative Party will bow to the pressure of corporations. So when Andrew Scheer in this press conference is saying, that the the decision to be made this fall is to go with one of these two parties who will continue to bend to corporate interests. I beg to say that it's going to go to the party that's going to stand up for Canadians and stand up for people over corporate interests who keep getting these sweetheart deals from the government, who's quite frankly willing to go to the extreme of breaking the law.
Let me bring in Peter MacKay here again on another issue. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier, that yesterday the Prime Minister was asked about the report by Anne McClellan as to a former Attorney General and Justice Minister, Liberal Attorney General and Justice Minister. She was asked to look into whether the roles of Attorney General and Justice Minister should be separated. Well, that report just came out.
Surprise, surprise.
Well, and we know that the Prime Minister will be addressing it. In fact, the report date is June 28th when it was completed. And the question is, it says that no. She says that those two roles should stay one singular role. What's your thought on this?
My first thought overall is that it's a distraction. It's a smoke bomb. It's an attempt to muddy the waters on this issue. This McClellan report, whatever it's finding, has nothing to do with the issues itself of whether the Attorney General was pressured, whether there was in fact obstruction of justice. This is an issue that deals with basically the internal machinations of the Department of Justice and Attorney General. The bigger issue, Hannah, is something that has already been dealt with, and that was taking the Director of Public Prosecution's office out of the Department of Justice and AG and making it arm's length. And it worked. It allowed the Director of Public Prosecutions to make a decision independent of political influence. And she did her job. So the system worked, the system held. Now, the Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould in this case, had oversight, had the ability to overturn the Director of Public Prosecutions and said, no, I'm not going to do that. It wouldn't be appropriate. It would be interference, and it would be done for all the reasons that we know.
What do you say, though, to the people out there that
and
are
let me just add, she'd have to have made that decision to overturn Kathleen Roussel. She'd have to have gazetted it.
Which
so
means
we would have known and given
public.
reasons.
Yeah,
Correct.
it would have been made public. But what do you say to the arguments, Mr. MacKay, that, you know, this was human resources, that the Prime Minister said, I want you to go find another opinion, potentially a Supreme Court justice, and just take a look at this?
Because, Hannah, it's basic common sense. You don't call judges and you don't call prosecutors when they're in the midst of making a decision, especially after they've made the decision. So there was a blazing red line, full stop, flashing, don't go there. And there was nobody in the PM's office that told them that. Where was the legal advice or the oversight of the Prime Minister himself? It should have been the clerk of the Privy Council, and yet he was, now we know, complicit in this ongoing effort. So we now have more facts than we had before. If there's to be further investigation, and by the way, I'm quick to add, the OECD have waded in, and so is the World Bank. So this has far-reaching ripple effects that's affecting Canada's rule of law reputation. We're going to see a drop, I predict, in where we are in the corruption index. This is bad, reputationally, not just for the Prime Minister and the Liberal government. This is bad for Canada. It's a sad day for Canada.
Tracy Ramsey, you were nodding at times, shaking your head at other times.
Yeah, we still don't have the truth. I mean, there's so many people that we don't have information from that were involved in this story. Bill Morneau, you know, in some way now, Bill Morneau is trying to claim that he doesn't remember, you know, some of these things happening. Who doesn't remember this as the Minister of Finance in a government where this is the biggest political scandal that they've ever seen? You've got staff that are in the PMO, that are in the Minister of Finance office, who we still haven't heard from, who were certainly named in testimony. And we hear, again, the very concerning report today where the Ethics Commissioner is telling us that even throughout the investigation, they were being blocked by the Prime Minister's office from receiving all the information they need. So even this report today is not based on the entire story. We still don't have the whole truth as to what happened. There are people like Katie Telford, Marquez, there are many people throughout the staff infrastructure who played a key role in this and certainly knew what was going on and that they were pressuring, you know, in this way. And of course, we have the emails and everything to prove that. So what about those voices? Yeah. What happened there? Bill Morneau played a key role in this, and he's really trying to skate away from it. And let's not forget the fact that Jody Wilson-Raybould and Minister Philpott kicked right out of Liberal caucus, running as independents because of this. There's an attempt to ruin these women's careers, and all because they, you know, had the gall to stand up to the most powerful person in the country.
And Tracy Ramsey, what is your reaction to Anne McClellan's report on whether whether or not to separate the role from the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General. She is, as Hannah was mentioning, a former Attorney General and Minister of Justice, a Liberal. And she says, and this is the key line from her report, I do not believe that further structural change is required in Canada to protect prosecutorial independence and promote public confidence in the criminal justice system. What I think that means is she does not believe that we need to separate these roles. What do you make of that report coming out? It is dated, as Hannah was saying, at the end of June, coming out
It's been held from us.
on a day like today.
Listen, this isn't the story, right? This was an attempt to pivot away from the story. This was something that the Liberals chose to do to try to change the channel in the heat of the SNC-Lavalin scandal. And it didn't work then. It's not going to work today. This is not what the story is all about. And, you know, that they appointed a former Liberal cabinet minister, I think speaks volumes. You know, Canadians right now have a trust issue. They know that they can't trust the Prime Minister because he has been saying for the past several months, you know, I didn't do anything wrong. She experienced these things differently. You know, he has been doing everything in his power to say that he did not break the law, and we now know that he has. So this report that's coming from her really, quite frankly, is not going to change the channel at this point in time either, and it's not what the root of this story is about. This is about a corporation going to the Prime Minister and asking him to politically interfere with the Attorney General, which then he does. And we all know the evidence that's come forward, but again, we still don't have that full story. We will, you know, will we ever get a national public inquiry, which is something we've called for from the beginning, or will we just continue to see excuses and deflection and trying to say this is a human resources things, there were personality conflicts, smearing Jody Wilson-Raybould, talking about this report today, these pivots that quite frankly, you know, Canadians deserve better. Canadians deserve the truth.
I want to bring in Peter MacKay again and just ask about your personal thoughts on Jody Wilson-Raybould. You know, she used to be Attorney General and Justice Minister. She got kicked out of the Liberal caucus, and now she's running as an independent. What are your thoughts on how that all unfolded and how it's going to unfold from here on in?
Well, I think the political optics are horrific for the Prime Minister because it goes to his brand. Feminist, working for Aboriginal people. This blows much of that narrative out of the water because ask Jody Wilson-Raybould how she feels the Prime Minister's credibility is on those two issues. The other expression that Tracy just referenced was she experienced it differently. Well, where did we hear that? In the groping affair from what happened out in BC. This was a very serious issue that came and went. But again, this attempt to sort of deflect away or to somehow characterize it as different than what really happened. Jody Wilson-Raybould paid an enormous political price, lost the job that she loved and coveted, and now she's running as an independent. Somebody said earlier today, will she be apologized to? Will the Prime Minister make some sort of personal plea? Yes, he should. Will he invite her back into the caucus? No, the Liberals just nominated their candidate in her riding, so she has already paid that price. You know, having worn both of those hats of Attorney General and Justice Minister, this finding by Anne McClellan is interesting, but has really nothing to do with the issue of what is going on here, and that is corruption, SNC, and interference in the criminal justice system and pressuring the prosecutor.
And Tracy Ramsey, I just want to let our viewers know that we were expecting to hear from the Prime Minister at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That is obviously running a little bit late, but we can expect a lot of questions to him about all of this. And a key question, I think, may be from reporters, are you sorry? Are you sorry? Are you going to apologize to Jody Wilson-Raybould? Is that a key point for you?
Yeah, I mean, there were attempts to get this out of him before, right? And he, quite frankly, could not bring himself to say that he'd done anything wrong.
Is it different now? Now that the Commissioner has said, you have done something wrong, you broke the law, does that change it in terms of how we expect him to react?
The Prime Minister knows he did something wrong. He knew it back when he wouldn't apologize. He's known it all along when he was trying to turn the channel. He's known it when he tried to smear her. He knew it when he kicked her out of caucus. He knew it when he kicked Jane Philpott out for standing up for her. He's known this all along. He's just been caught. He's been caught in all of this, this story that he's created, that he's fabricated. And so, you know, will an apology today really suffice? for Jody Wilson-Raybould, or quite frankly for the women of Canada. I mean, women all over were infuriated by this treatment. You know, here you have some bright young women that were attracted to Parliament, who came in, who held very significant portfolios, who were widely respected on all sides of the House, and look at how they were treated. You know, women in Canada are still very angry about that, and an apology at this point is too little too late, because the damage has already been done.
We know that Andrew Scheer had called on the Prime Minister to resign in the past. That's not something that's likely to happen here, and there's lots of reasons for it. We're in a pre-election cycle, but also there's no real way to even go forward to remove a Prime Minister here in Canada.
Well, we don't have impeachment proceedings. Parliament has, for all intents and purposes, been dissolved, although there are ways to bring it back, for example, if we had to ratify the free trade agreement under short notice. But you're right, we're in a different place than when this issue first came forward. And so we're in an election, pre-election mode, soon to be a writ, and I don't think, if I'm Andrew Scheer, I want the Prime Minister to resign. I want to run against him. I want to stick all of this to him and hold him to account and hold those scandals up to the Canadian people and say, this is what you get. I'm a fresh face, I'm a new party, I have new ideas, then talk about his platform, but he wants to run against this Prime Minister is my bet.
And Tracy Ramsey and Peter, you can respond to this too. We should point out that people have been wondering what kind of penalty or fines could be applied to the Prime Minister for contravening the Conflict of Interest Act. And we have heard that that Dion's office has told us that the Commissioner can impose fines in some cases, but those penalties do not apply here. The Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner does not have the power to impose sanctions in this case. What do you make of that?
Well, we've consistently called for more power, for more independence, for the Ethics Commissioner to have the ability to do that, because quite frankly, this Prime Minister has been found to break the ethics rules previously. He broke the Conflict of Interest Act. This isn't the first time that he's done it. Certainly this is more explosive, I would say, than the previous one, but they're both equally wrong. And so, what has happened under previous governments and this government is, they have taken all the powers away from the Ethics Commissioner to hold them accountable. Even if there were to be some sort of fine, they can waive it for themselves. So they've made themselves this golden nest where no one can touch them, no matter what they do. Even if they're found guilty in these cases, there's no repercussions for them. So, where's the deterrent to governments from doing exactly what they've done and exactly what Justin Trudeau has just been found guilty of?
I think that's right. There isn't any real accountability at the end of the day based on this finding. The finding and the accountability will come in an election campaign, but the Prime Minister arguably is a prior offender now, having been found guilty previously, as was the Finance Minister. And I think in his case, there was a financial penalty set out against him. But what we're talking about here is now the court of public opinion, and the ethics counselor has no ability to subpoena records, no ability to compel witnesses. That's arguably one of the flaws of our parliamentary committee system as well. So I think there's also lessons, again, machinery of government discussions around how we can make the ethics counselor, commissioner's office more ability to deliver results for the people. But a $200 fine, that's a bottle of wine or several boxes of cardboard, plastic, drinky bottle things.
All right. Let's end it there. That was great. Thank you both very much. That is NDP MP Tracy Ramsey joining us from Windsor, Ontario. And here in studio, we have former Conservative Cabinet Minister Peter MacKay and, of course, the CBC's Hannah Thibodeau. I am seeing in one of my monitors here a shot of Niagara-on-the-Lake, where we are expecting to hear from the Prime Minister any moment now. There it is. That is the podium for Niagara-on-the-Lake. Again, we're expecting to hear from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We expect there to be a statement or at least questions from reporters, and they will probably all be focused in around this, that the Prime Minister, if you're just joining us, a reminder of some of the key points from the Ethics Commissioner. The report found the Prime Minister contravened Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest Act. The PM used his authority to circumvent and undermine the public prosecutor's decision. You may remember that SNC was facing a criminal trial. That's a Montreal engineering company. And the commissioner found Justin Trudeau and his top officials sought to have the Attorney General overrule that decision by the prosecutor. The report also says senior staff would not have acted without knowing the Prime Minister's position on the SNC-Lavalin matter. And the commissioner also stated that partisan political interests were improperly put before the Attorney General for her consideration in the case. Let's get some more analysis. We'll stay in Ottawa, and joining me now is the host of CBC's Power and Politics, Vassy Kapelos. And Vassy, another big day. You know, this was big in the winter, early spring, then it kind of went away, and now it's back. What's your first reaction to the Ethics Commissioner's findings?
Yeah, it's so interesting because this was so top of mind for so many Canadians, and it really affected the popular support for the Liberals back in February, in March, and April. It actually completely changed the trajectory that the party was on and had the Conservatives above them. Recently, though, we've seen a change of fortune, so much so that I remember talking to Eric Grenier, our polls analyst for CBC, just 2 days ago, and he was saying, for the first time since SNC, it's more probable that the Liberals will win more seats than the Conservatives. So the first time in months that had happened, and now this is definitely something that can change the channel. On the one hand, the timing insofar as what I just described is pretty bad for the Liberals. On the other hand, maybe if this had dropped October 17th, it could be a lot worse. But certainly this allows the opposition, as you just heard from Mr. McKay, from Ms. Ramsey, from Mr. Scheer, Mr. Singh, to be able to say, hey, this is the Liberals helping out their friends in high places. This is a Prime Minister who is not as ethical as he promised, or nowhere close to as ethical as he promised to be in the last election. And that is how they will continue to frame this issue day in and day out for every single day until October 21st.
And Vassy, for those of you just joining us, on the right of the screen we're showing a live shot that is Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, where the Prime Minister is expected. He was expected at 2 o'clock. Maybe there's a little more time in terms of how he is going to react to this. This is certainly big news. I want to ask you, Vassy, does this change things for him in terms of how he is going to respond? I mean, we'll have to wait and see. I know you can't predict the future. Will there be an apology? That's a key question now that the Prime Minister, and you can remind us of this, Vassy, the Prime Minister felt as though he didn't do anything wrong, that maybe there could have been handled differently, but he never apologized to Jody Wilson-Raybould because he says, in his opinion, he didn't do anything wrong. Well, the Ethics Commissioner, independent commissioner, has said, well, no, Prime Minister, you did do something wrong.
Yeah, that's why I think you've hit the nail on the head. His response that we are anticipating right now is so key and will be so significant in the way this story develops. He was insistent. I remember that day where he gave a press conference and we had all been anticipating, there's going to be some kind of apology. And the Liberals had even kind of telegraphed the night before that there might be. There would be an acknowledgement that things could have been done differently or better, and an apology to Jody Wilson-Raybould. And none of that happened that day. Instead, it was kind of hard to make out exactly what kind of defense the Prime Minister was making. We know that they insisted they were doing this because of jobs and because of the possibility of, negative economic consequences. But specifically, you're right. He really did sort of never copped doing anything wrong when it comes to the way in which he communicated with Jody Wilson-Raybould or the actions he took in this case and where she was concerned. So will this be sort of like the time where the Ethics Commissioner ruled on the Aga Khan, where he will say, I accept these findings, I was wrong, I'm sorry, let's move on. Will he acknowledge wrongdoing? I think that is the key question as we look towards his comments in the next few minutes. Will the Prime Minister say, I did something wrong, the Ethics Commissioner is right, it's laid out here, I'm sorry for my conduct in this matter. I'm not sure what to predict, you're absolutely right, it's hard, but I would be surprised to see that all these months later. I guess it's from a communication standpoint, it'll be interesting to see, does that then help them move forward, or does this keep the issue live? I'm not sure. It's a hard one to figure out. It is a hard
one, yeah. And it is, the difference, I think, in the winter and in the early spring is that it was the winter and the early spring. It wasn't 10 weeks out from a federal election, right, Vassy? So now that kind of changes things. And we saw that the Liberals did take a hit in the polls in the winter and early spring, and then they seem to bounce back if you believe the polls. I mean, the only really important poll is Election Day, but it raises that question again. Is this an important issue to Canadians? It's the middle of August. Are Canadians even paying attention to this issue? And does this stick? And does the Prime Minister and the Liberals, will they pay a political price?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that goes into sort of analyzing whether that will be the case. It's the timing of it. It's how much of this sort of fits a narrative about the Prime Minister. Does this sort of amp up the idea that he promised us one thing and delivered something else? I think you're right that this is close to the election, and therefore everything that happens now could potentially have more of an impact than it did months ago. But even months ago, when many were insisting, nobody cares, this is just a sort of dispute between two people, and that may be true to a certain extent, but people did care. And those polls, while they're not exact predictors of what will happen, and sometimes they get it wrong, they do sort of measure how Canadians feel about an issue at a point in time. And we did see most certainly a deviation from the way things had been going for many months prior to the SNC story breaking. So it broke in February, and all the way until a few weeks ago, it had the Liberals trailing the Conservatives, essentially, if you aggregate all the polls, as Eric Grenier does. And specifically in the efficiency of that vote, so how many seats that translates to, and essentially what you need to win a majority or to win government or to form government, it showed that the Conservatives had a higher chance of doing so, and that was specifically since SNC. As I mentioned off the top there, that switched in the last few weeks, and the Liberals again went back to a place where they were more likely to win more seats. So you're absolutely right to sort of think. I'm not sure whether this will change the dial. I think that the headlines will do the Prime Minister no favors. I mean, the conclusion that this ethics commissioner reached is a damning one, and there's no way around that. And this headline will stick for a number of weeks. That said, campaigns still matter, and we are not even in the official campaign yet. So there are a number of weeks to go. The narrative can shift. It would have been worse if this happened 5 days out from the election. I could guarantee that. But it really does depend on a whole host of factors.
All right, and so Vashi, there's so much to follow on this story. At the same time, and maybe help, let's talk about this, is Anne McClelland's report, and whether or not, and it all comes down to this, right? The issue of the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General being the same person. One is a political role, one is, more just is supposed to be off to the side and not political. And tell us about that report and the significance and the timing of its release today.
All in one, just two for one package today. So the background to this report is important because it speaks to a lot of what the government was saying to defend its own actions throughout this controversy. The idea is that one person is the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice. The Attorney General has a very specific function in that that role is not supposed to consider political things. It's supposed to be all about the rule of law and upholding the rule of law. The Justice Minister performs, though, as any other cabinet colleague would. And so you sit around the cabinet table, you think about, you are permitted, let's use the word loosely, to consider things like politics, things like economic consequences, all those things that people sitting around a cabinet table usually consider. What the government had said was they assumed that when they were communicating with Jody Wilson-Raybould about those types of considerations where SNC was concerned and the possibility of a DPA or a criminal conviction, that's what they anticipated they were talking about. That they said, oh, this is the Justice Minister. This is supposed to be what you consider as a Minister of the Crown in Canada. And Jody Wilson-Raybould's response to that was, well, no, in this capacity, I was the Attorney General, and I was sort of, apart from those types of considerations. So this led then to the Prime Minister asking Anne McClelland, of course, a former prestigious Liberal cabinet minister, to look into, and Deputy Prime Minister, to look into this and figure out whether or not the two roles should be separated. There have been other justice ministers in the past that have advocated that. There have been conversations around this topic in the past. This isn't the first instance of them. And in fact, the ethics commissioner goes over some of that in his report. But what Anne McClelland was to determine was whether or not going forward the roles should be split. In the end, she determined that they shouldn't. And that was kind of interesting. You heard Peter MacKay and Tracy Ramsey on your show a few minutes ago say, oh, this is all just a distraction. And that was sort of the opposition's response when the investigation was initially called for by the Prime Minister, that they're trying to make this about the role of the Justice Minister and the Attorney General, but really this is just about right and wrong.
It is interesting that it's dated June 28th? June 28th, and that it's out today. That's somewhat interesting. Why today?
Yeah, she was supposed to. We had actually had a confirmation from the Prime Minister's office that they received it. It's funny that it came out today, and I kept asking over the past few weeks, well, when will this be released? And then all of a sudden, done, and they just kept saying we have nothing to add. I asked if there was a timeline. I think it was 2 weeks ago. We have nothing to add. And then yesterday, the Prime Minister, in response, the Conservatives had actually put out a release saying, where is this thing? And the Prime Minister, in response to a reporter's question, said it will be timed with the Ethics Commissioner's report, that they submitted that to the Ethics Commissioner as part of its report. I then went back to the Prime Minister's office and said, well, was that the Ethics Commissioner who asked you to do that, or are you doing that of your own volition? Is this, some sort of a decision you made for whatever consideration? And again, was told they have nothing to add. So they've had it in their hands for a little while. I think they just wanted it all to drop at once and take the sort of worst of it all together, I would guess. I don't know that for a fact, but from a communications perspective, that would make sense. I think what this does is take away a bit of the argument that they were making, right? It sort of deflates it, that this didn't all happen because the roles are all mushed together and not clear enough and not separate enough, that there were other factors at play, and the Ethics Commissioner lays those out. Anne McClellan does go over some things that should happen in order to better separate the two and better sort of familiarize other cabinet colleagues with that, and that includes changing the oath that the Attorney General takes and the Justice Minister takes, but really nothing huge here to say, yes, there's a big problem and we need to separate these roles.
Vashi, another busy day. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
That is the CBC's Vashi Capellos, host of Power and Politics, obviously her show starting in a couple of hours from now, and this will be the big story today. She joined us from Ottawa. This is the scene live in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, where any moment now the Prime Minister is expected to address the Ethics Commissioner's report. It finds that Trudeau broke the conflict of interest rules in the SNC-Lavalin affair. So how will the Prime Minister respond? We'll bring that to you live soon as it begins. All right, for more on all this, I want to turn to my next guest. Omar Khan is Vice President of Public Affairs at Hill and Knowlton. He previously served as Chief of Staff in several provincial Liberal ministerial offices, and Shakir Chambers is Senior Consultant at Navigator, and previously he helped craft the Ontario PC platform during the Doug Ford campaign. And of course, Hannah Thibodeau is here in studio with us. All right, so Omar, we've been speaking to Conservatives and NDP. We did speak, I think Suhanna spoke with a Liberal strategist a few hours ago, but it's been a while. So now that you've had some time to look at this report, the Ethics Commissioner and its finding that the Prime Minister broke the law, what's your reaction?
So it's not good. We've discussed this. I think you've been discussing this. That having something like this drop 10 weeks before a general election is not something any political party would want. From a political strategy perspective, I suspect that a lot of Canadians have already made up their minds on this issue. Most of the information that we're talking about today has been in the public domain for a very long time.
But to be fair, the Ethics Commissioner, the Prime Minister has always said, I didn't do anything wrong. So I'm not apologizing to Jody Wilson-Raybould because I didn't do anything wrong. The Ethics Commissioner is saying, not only did you do something wrong, you broke the law.
Well, I think the Prime Minister has said that there have been learnings here, and I agree. There's definitely things that happened throughout the course of this saga that could have and should have been done differently. I think the key for the Prime Minister and his team moving forward now will be to admit that there are learnings, that changes need to be made. I used to work for an Attorney General in Ontario. I do think the roles should be split. But then, talk about what is upcoming and what is very important for Canadians, which is a general election campaign, where they'll be asked to make a very important decision. And that decision is, do you want to support a Prime Minister who believes in climate change, who believes in playing a leading role in leading the global fight against climate change, or do you want to go backwards? Do you want to support a Prime Minister who has lifted 800,000 Canadians out of poverty, or do you want to go backwards? That's the real choice that's before Canadians. This isn't helpful, what has happened today. But, let's just put it all into context.
Shakir, do you think that's going to be the real choice before Canadians? Do you think that's how it's going to play out?
I think Canadians need to have all the information on the table. As the Ethics Commissioner pointed out, there's still a lot of material that wasn't provided to them, either through interviews or through documents, because the government refuses to waive cabinet confidence. So the fact that you're saying that there's all the information that's been presented to Canadians, that's simply not the case. The fact of the matter is the Prime Minister broke the ethics code. This is not the first time he's done so. This is the second time he's done so. The fact of the matter is he put partisan political interest above the law. And the fact of the matter is he campaigned on ethics and transparency and accountability, and he has not delivered.
And so do you think, and I just want to remind viewers what they're looking at here on the right of their screen,
We can see the Prime Minister walking up there now.
There it is. So we're going to hear from Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, as he is approaching the mic following this report by the Ethics Commissioner. Let's listen in.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Betty DeCero, and I am the Lord Mayor of the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake. I am joined today by my... Thank you. I'm joined today by my fellow mayors, Mayor Steele, Mayor Ugolini, Mayor Junkin, Mayor Sendzik, and first and foremost, our regional chair, Jim Bradley. I'm also joined today by my colleagues of council, Councillors Wiens, Burrows, and Arsenault. We would like to welcome the Prime Minister and his entourage to Niagara-on-the-Lake. As you know, Prime Minister, Niagara-on-the-Lake is the first home of English Canada and holds many firsts, not only for our country, but around the world. If I can take a moment to boast, Laura Secord's walk started our nation. We were the first in the British Empire to legislate the start of the abolition of slavery. As well, we are blessed with rich soil that enables our farmers to have amazing orchards and vineyards. Because of this, we see millions of tourists each year, and our population in our settlement areas is growing. As a municipality, we work on trying not only to manage that economy, but first and foremost, our obligations.
All right, so you are looking at the scene live in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, where you can see the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is there along with some other regional and local officials there. We are expecting the Prime Minister to approach that podium any moment now, and he will be undoubtedly asked by reporters his reaction to finding today by the Ethics Commissioner that he contravened the Conflict of Interest Act. This is all around, if you're just joining us, the inappropriate pressure that the former Attorney General and Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould, said that she felt with regard to a deferred prosecution agreement being sought for SNC-Lavalin. So we are going to take the Prime Minister's remarks as soon as he approaches that microphone and see what he has to say about all of this. Omar Khan and Shakir, Omar Khan, a Liberal, Shakir Chambers, a Conservative. I'm just shorthanding all of this, but let's listen in. All right, let's listen to the Prime Minister.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And thank you, Lord Mayor DeCero, for that introduction. You are truly an incredible voice in your community. I also want to recognize Mayor McGarvey, the President of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and Bill Karsten, the President of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And speaking of strong voices for the Niagara region, a big shout out to our outstanding MPs here with us this afternoon, Chris Biddle and Vance Badaway. People here know they can count on Chris and Vance to work hard every day on their behalf. In fact, delivering real results for the middle class is exactly why we're here today. Over the
last 4 years, our government has made significant investments in the Niagara region. Whether it was to improve transit or to build affordable housing, we have been working with local leaders on critical projects. And in March, we announced even more support for new local projects.
For infrastructure in Budget 2019, we're doubling the amount of money that municipalities get through the federal transfer. What that means for people in Ontario is funding that goes directly to municipal infrastructure priorities, projects that matter to you. Because the reality is that some provincial governments have decided to play politics and withhold infrastructure dollars meant for communities. I don't have to tell anyone in Ontario what cuts to funding mean for families, for students, and for seniors. Just take the millions of dollars on the line for the new Niagara sports facilities to host the 2021 Canada Summer Games, an initiative that's in jeopardy because the provincial government won't prioritize it. Well, Our government knows that it isn't by refusing to fund local projects that we make life better for the middle class. It's by investing in Canadians and in their future. Look no further than right here in the Niagara region. With almost $14 million for the Niagara area through the municipal top-up, we're getting shovels in the ground for important projects. From improving public transit and helping families get around faster, to making sure that seniors have a safe and affordable place to live, these investments make a positive difference in people's lives. My friends, when we work together, we build a stronger economy, good middle-class jobs, and thriving communities for people to raise their families. Encore une fois,
once again, it's fantastic to be here in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I'd now like to turn it over to Mayor McGarvey, and after that, I'll be pleased to take your questions.
Jimmy.
Let's move that down a little bit. Good afternoon, bonjour, Annie. My name is Jamie McGarvey, President of the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and the Mayor.
All right, so there we have the Prime Minister is addressing the crowd there, and he is going to take some questions. He didn't address the key question, I think, that's on the mind of a lot of Canadians right now. Obviously, he's there ahead of an election campaign in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, but we're going to talk with our Vasha Capellos is in Ottawa. We're going to talk to her once we hear from reporters and their questions. We're going to talk with Hannah Thibodeau here in studio and Shakir Chambers and Omar Khan, who, Omar, I want to ask you, do you think that the Prime Minister should approach that microphone and say, I was wrong, I am sorry, and I'm sorry to Canadians, I am sorry to Jody Wilson-Raybould?
Oh, I think he should say what he said before, which is that things could have been done differently and should have been done differently. You know, the important thing to keep in mind here is the intent behind what was done. And you can argue whether or not what was done was appropriate or inappropriate. But the intent, and this is proven through all of the email records and the testimony at the Select Committee, the intent was always about making sure that thousands of Canadians who work for this company, who have no responsibility to bear for any past misdeeds that may have occurred with respect to this company, are not penalized by losing their livelihoods. That was the core
There's some
intention.
question, though, about whether or not that would have been the case. They would have had jobs with other firms. They would have been able to...
Perhaps. But nobody can argue, if you look at the record in writing and the record in testimony, that the overarching objective behind all of these discussions was about doing whatever could be done or exploring whatever avenues were available to try and protect those jobs of hardworking Canadians.
And Omar, I think you can talk intent, but you know, when we were younger, we were taught if you do something wrong and you're caught doing something wrong, the easiest thing is to apologize to move forward. Is that not the simplest way for him? It's like, okay, I realize that something happened here. They've said it's wrong. Let's just try to move forward.
I think from a communications perspective, it's always very difficult to argue with the finding of an independent officer of the legislature, whether or not they are not the voice of God. But it is difficult politics to do that. So I would advise him not to do that. Hopefully he's listening. But that being said, you know, he has already said that things should have been done and could have been done differently. And I think Canadians are open and forgiving enough to accept that, and to really look towards the general election, which is a big choice for Canadians. And it's going to be a choice between two visions. There's only two people on the ballot who can be Prime Minister, and that's Andrew Scheer and Justin Trudeau. And it's a clear difference in their visions for this country. And one wants to fight climate change, one wants to put his head in the sand. One wants to lift people out of poverty into the middle class. You know, one supports premiers across this country who are making cuts to services that support the middle class and cutting taxes for the wealthy.
And Shakira, it's interesting, Omar, that you used the words Canadians are forgiving, because Andrew Scheer, the leader of the Conservative Party, he used the word, this is unforgivable. Those were the words he said. You know what, the Aga Khan trip, that was shocking. And then he called on the Prime Minister to resign over this whole SNC-Lavalin. He said, no, I don't want him to resign. I want to defeat him on October 21st. But this finding is unforgivable. Is that how you would characterize this investigation and this report?
It is unforgivable. I mean, at the end of the day, Canadians are going to make their choices come election day. But I think when Omar talks about the intent, the Ethics Commissioner made it very clear. The intent was to undermine and circumvent the authority of Minister Raybould, right? Every politician wants to protect jobs, wants to create jobs. But creating jobs is not above the law, right? The law is central to Canadian society. And for the Prime Minister to think that he and his staff can go around the law to partisan political interests above Canadian law, I think it's just wrong. It's unforgivable, as Mr. Shearer said.
Should the Prime Minister apologize to?
I think he has no choice but to apologize. And again, not just to Minister Raybould, who's suffered great political consequences, but to Canadians. As I said earlier, he campaigned on being different. He campaigned on doing politics differently, and he hasn't done anything differently.
Well, so again, we'll speak to intent, right? So I don't think that there's any evidence that's been put forward to suggest that the Prime Minister or those around him felt that they were operating outside of the legal, outside of what's kosher legally. You can argue that they were right or wrong, but I don't think any evidence has been presented to suggest that.
The Ethics Commissioner said they were incorrect.
He said they were incorrect, but I'm talking about intent. I'm talking about intent, right? So I like what former Deputy Prime Minister and Attorney General Anne McClellan came out with today. I do think there's greater clarity required around the separation of the role of law officer of the Crown, which is the Attorney General, and that of Justice Minister. I think we need more protocols in place to ensure that those roles
what would
remain
it have
separate.
done different in this case?
Well, look, it can be confusing. I've been a senior advisor to an Ontario Attorney General, and it is a dual role, right? So you are the attorney, as the Attorney General, you're the chief law officer of the Crown, so you're responsible for the administration of justice, but you're also the Minister of Justice, which is a policy function. So it's a political cabinet function. And when you are before a cabinet and delivering legal advice, it's hard sometimes to separate those two roles. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but there are other jurisdictions like the United Kingdom and others where they have separated out these two roles specifically for this, specifically because of this issue, and to avoid some of the confusion, I think, that we have seen in this instance.
So, but Shakir, is that the story today? Is this, you know?
That's not the story. As it was said earlier, if you look at the date on the report that came out as far as separating the two ministries.
June 28th.
Yeah, quite a coincidence that it came out on June 28th, but it's being publicly released today on the day that this ruling comes out.
Sorry to interrupt. Here is the Prime Minister. Let's listen.
I'm happy to take questions from media now.
Mr. Prime Minister, Samantha Craigs from the CBC, and if you could answer my questions in English and French. This is in regards to the Ethics Commissioner report. You promised to do politics differently. Millions voted for you on that basis. What would you say to those who are disappointed now, and what responsibility do you think you have about what has transpired?
First off, I want to thank the Ethics Commissioner for his report. And even though I disagree with some of his conclusions, I fully accept this report and take responsibility for everything that happened. Where I disagree with the Commissioner, amongst others, is where he says and takes a strong perspective that any contact with the AG, the Attorney General, in this issue was improper. My job as a Prime Minister is to stand up for Canadians and defend their interests. And yes, it is essential that we do that in a way that defends our institutions, that upholds prosecutorial independence. But we need to be able to talk about the impacts on Canadians right across the country of decisions being made. But I accept the report that the Commissioner put forward, and even in advance of this report, a number of months ago, I tasked former Attorney General Anne McClellan to gather a group of experts, including many former Attorneys General and academics and political experts, to weigh in on this question, to figure out how to move forward in a way that allows us to uphold the interests of Canadians and advocate for the interests of Canadians, while at the same time fully respecting prosecutorial independence. And I look forward to implementing the various recommendations she made, because what happened over the past year shouldn't have happened. I take responsibility for it. We need to make sure that my government or any government going forward never is in that situation again.
In French, please.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Ethics Commissioner for his work and his report. Even though I disagree with some of his conclusions, I do accept that report fully. And I take full responsibility for everything that occurred. But where I disagree is on his conclusion that any contact with the Attorney General on this issue was necessarily inappropriate. A fundamental part of my job and the job of any politician is to represent and defend the interests of all Canadians, the public interest. And we have an obligation, and we must be able to defend the public interest while at the same time respecting the prosecutorial independence, and that's why for several months I asked the former Attorney General Anne McClellan to deliver a report, and she consulted with many experts before making her recommendations on how to improve the system. Currently, no government should be in the position where there's a contradiction between the public interest and our judicial system.
Do you have any plans to resign or at least apologize formally?
I recognize that this was a situation that shouldn't have happened. But my desire to protect Canadians and at the same time to protect the integrity and the independence of our judicial institutions remained throughout. But we recognize that the way this happened shouldn't have happened. And I take responsibility for the mistakes that I made. At the same time, we learned many lessons through that, and we're aided and will be aided by the McClellan report, which has been released today.
En français.
I recognize that what happened should not have happened, but at the same time, I was doing what I felt would be the responsibility of any Prime Minister, which is to defend the public interest while ensuring the integrity of our institutions. Of course, that did not happen the right way, and my government or any government should not have to face such a situation. And as a result, we will be making recommendations and acting on the ones in the McClellan report.
The Ethics Commissioner found the authority of the Prime Minister and his office was used to circumvent, undermine, and ultimately attempt to discredit the decision of the Director of Public Prosecutions as well as the authority of Ms. Wilson-Raybould. Senior officials in your office were liaising with SNC officials the entire time. Will you fire Elder Marquez and Mathieu Bouchard, and will you keep Gerald Butts on your campaign?
As I said, I take full responsibility. The buck stops with the Prime Minister, and I assume responsibility for everything that happened in my office. This is important. Because I truly feel that what happened over the past year shouldn't have happened. But we, at the same time, have a system in which we have to make improvements. There are many lessons to be learned on this, and that's why we will be moving forward with the recommendations on how to both advocate for the public interest and defend the integrity and the independence of our judicial and prosecutorial processes. Those things together are important linchpins of our system, and they shouldn't be put into conflict as they were, as spelled out by the Ethics Commissioner. So I recognize the lessons to be learned. I take them very seriously. I take, obviously, the Ethics Commissioner's report very seriously, and we will move forward to make sure that this never happens again under any government in this country.
We take this situation very seriously. It should not have happened. This conflict between the public interest and judicial independence, that should never have happened. And that is why I take full responsibility for what we did, but I also take responsibility about the fact that we need to change our processes and system and the way not only our government, but any government in future acts in a similar situation.
Elder Marquez, Matthew Bouchard will stay on, and as will Gerald Butts.
We are facing a moment in a couple of months where Canadians get to make a choice about the kind of government that they want to see lead them, and they will make judgments based on merits, based on experience, based on proposals and plan. I'm looking forward to continuing my conversations with Canadians about how we've delivered for people, but how much more work there is to do as we roll up our sleeves, as we learn lessons, and as we continue to deliver for the middle class and people working hard to join it with the great team that I have behind me and all around me.
En français?
Okay. J'ai bien hâte
I'm looking forward to being able to propose to Canadians our vision for the future in this election year. It will be an opportunity for Canadians to choose under what government they wish to continue to build their country. I'm very proud of all we've done, and I'm very conscious as well of all the things we've learned over the last 4 years. But I know that we still have a lot of work to do to make even more improvements to the situation of the middle class, the environment, and to help everyone in Canada. And that's what we intend to do in the coming months, and that's what I hope to be able to do over the next few years if Canadians so wish.
From the St. Catharines Standard and Torstar. In today's report, Mr. Dion points out that he was unable to fully complete his investigative mandate because he was impeded in getting information, cabinet confidences, by the Privy Clerk, which he really makes no bones about was a tremendous stumbling block to reach the end of his investigation. I mean, do you think that's an appropriate action by the Privy Clerk's office, and what will you, if anything, do about it?
The cabinet confidentiality and attorney-client privilege, solicitor-client privilege, are two of the fundamental elements that uphold our democracy and our system of government. So it was not a small thing for our government to decide to waive both solicitor-client privilege and cabinet confidence in the matter being studied both by the committee and by the Ethics Commissioner. We took that decision because we knew that it was important that Canadians, and obviously the Ethics Commissioner, would be able to access all information and hear all testimony in regards to the matter at hand. We did exactly that, and that is why we were able to have such fulsome parliamentary study and such a fulsome Ethics Commissioner's report. The decision by the Privy Council to not further extend into less relevant or non-relevant elements of cabinet confidentiality and solicitor-client privilege is an important one that maintains the integrity of our institutions and our capacity to function as a government without setting troublesome or worrisome precedents.
En français?
Nous avons pris l'étape et le geste sans précédent.
We took unprecedented steps which were to set aside the cabinet confidences and cabinet confidentiality as well as solicitor-client privilege. We knew that was important in order for the Ethics Commissioner and the Parliamentary Committee to be able to do their work. That was a significant action to ensure transparency and allow Canadians to know what happened. We recognize that this is something very important for good governance in this country, this type of confidentiality, but we set it aside as part of the inquiry on these issues because we realized it was important. And there must be limits when it comes to waiving this privilege and this principle, because we have a duty to continue to have a system that works properly in order to properly govern
You said
Canada.
a couple of times in answer to my colleagues that you take responsibility for what happened in this affair. And I harken back to something you wrote on Twitter, of all places, in 2013, when you said it's hard not to feel disappointed when you're in your government when there is a scandal, new scandal every day. This particular issue has been before Canadians now for many, many months. You've come into some intense criticism from the Commissioner today. When you say you take responsibility, what does that actually look like in concrete terms? And what do you say to disappointed Canadians who may not want to vote for you now based on what they're reading today?
Taking responsibility means recognizing that what we did over the past year wasn't good enough. But at the same time, I can't apologize for standing up for Canadian jobs, because that's part of what Canadians expect me to do. They expect me also to stand up for our institutions, and as the Ethics Commissioner pointed out, those two elements came into conflict in an unfortunate way for which I take full responsibility. But more than just taking responsibility for what happened in the past, it means making sure that this mistake never happens again. And that is why months ago, even before today, we asked a panel of experts to submit recommendations on how our government and all future governments will be able to balance and navigate through the very important principles of defending the public interest and respecting and upholding prosecutorial independence and the independence of our judiciary. Those recommendations, which are out today, are very much things that will allow us to move forward and make right what obviously didn't work over the last year as we tried to balance competing interests and fell short, as the Ethics Commissioner pointed out.
In French, please.
Taking responsibility is first and foremost recognizing the way we acted and realize that it wasn't the right way to act, even though our intentions were the best possible. We were seeking to defend the public interest while at the same time respecting judicial independence. We had a duty to do things differently. We should have done things differently, and that's why I asked a group of experts to make recommendations on how our government and any future government can ensure that those two things do not come into conflict again. And there have to be both, because that's what Canadians expect. We must be able to defend Canadians and their jobs while at the same time ensuring the independence of the Attorney General.
From the Canadian Press. So the report today shows that your government changed the criminal code after the SNC-Lavalin heavily lobbied your office and members of your cabinet for a legal escape hatch. How will you convince Canadians that this is not proof of some powerful corporate influence over your government?
The deferred prosecution agreements are an element that is in place in many, many countries around the world. Most of our most important allies have these. It allows a company that has been found guilty of wrongdoing to pay fines, to make restitution, to fix their behaviors, take responsibility for their behaviors along some very severe and well-established criteria. This is a measure that many of our allied countries have that Canada did not have in place. This was something that well before SNC-Lavalin, Canadian governments have looked at and have considered. It was an element lacking within the tools we have at our disposal to ensure proper behavior by corporations and opportunities for jobs and growth in the country. And that is why we move forward on bringing in these agreements.
En français.
Okay. The
measures that we introduced were measures that are frequently used in many, many countries around the world, which would allow a company that has made mistakes or violated the law to pay a penalty, change its behavior without automatically imperiling all the employees of that company, who for the most part are not at all responsible for the mistakes made by the management of the company. And this is a measure that exists in many countries, and for a number of years, well before this issue arose, Canada looked at the idea of having this tool to be able to deal with our company's competitors.
Mr. Prime Minister, Brittany Carter from the Lake Report. I was just wondering what your plan is to try and bring the riding to the Liberal locally, Niagara, Hamilton.
Well, listen, I'm very excited to be back in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and it's a pleasure to be here with our two MPs from neighboring ridings who have been doing a great job of representing this whole region in the House of Commons. But as you point out, it would be absolutely wonderful for the community of Niagara-on-the-Lake and Niagara Falls to be well represented by a strong Liberal candidate, and I very much look forward to working very hard over the coming weeks and months to make sure that the riding of Niagara Falls turns red on October 21st.
What is your plan to, I guess, make that happen?
What we're focusing on is investing in communities, whether it's infrastructure announcements like today, where we know that it is essential for growing communities to invest in wastewater, invest in public transit, invest in housing, invest in the kinds of needs that particularly areas where there is a tremendous amount of tourism need that infrastructure to be able to succeed. But on top of that, we know that creating jobs, creating opportunities for citizens goes with investing in those citizens themselves. The Canada Child Benefit has benefited 9 out of 10 Canadian families right across the country and has lifted hundreds of thousands of kids out of poverty. On top of that, an area that I know is very important for this region, we've signed major trade deals with all our other G7 nations, including and especially securing our trade with the United States, our most important partner, at a time of protectionism and uncertainty in the United States. These are the kinds of things we can do when we all work together, and having a strong voice for Niagara on the Lake and Niagara Falls is going to be extremely important to make sure we're continuing to deliver for this community and communities like it right across the country.
Just briefly back to SNC-Lavalin, Lisa Pileski on behalf of Global News. Can you say whether a DPA is still on the table?
That is a decision to be made by the Attorney General and Minister of Justice, not a decision for the Prime Minister to make.
Monsieur Trudeau, Colin Côté-Paulette de Radio-Canada.
Mr. Trudeau, Radio-Canada, this is the second time that the Ethics Commissioner has concluded that you violated the law. And I think it's the first time this has happened to a Prime Minister. How can Canadians have confidence in you as Prime Minister? Well, the fact is that being in government means making difficult choices, and we worked very hard both to defend the integrity of our judicial system while at the same time defending the interests of all Canadians and all Canadian workers who might be affected by such a decision. Of course, as the Ethics Commissioner pointed out, we did not find the right balance in that situation, and that's why we are moving forward by changing our system so that we can always defend the public interest without there being any vulnerability for the Attorney General.
I think one of the things, sorry, let me just pause and retranslate in my brain. I think we recognize that what was done over the past year as we tried to both defend judicial independence and prosecutorial independence and stand up for Canadian jobs and workers wasn't exactly the right way to do things. And we thank the Ethics Commissioner for the hard work that he did in highlighting that. But it's not enough to just recognize that we did it the wrong way. We have to be able to put in place solutions so this doesn't happen again by our government or any other government. We need to be able to stand up for jobs and for the public interest in a way that doesn't go against prosecutorial independence. And that's where the McClellan report, which has been released today, lays out very clear steps that will be followed to ensure that this kind of conflict never happens again by this government or any future government.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you all so much for being here today. We'll be supported with the mayors. Excellent.
And that is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, answering questions almost exclusively on the Ethics Commissioner's finding that the Prime Minister contravened the Conflict of Interest Act all around the SNC-Lavalin affair. You'll remember this is the affair where former Justice Minister, Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould said that the Prime Minister and members of his staff inappropriately pressured her to pursue a deferred prosecution agreement for SNC-Lavalin, which is a Montreal-based or Montreal-headquartered engineering firm. We heard the Prime Minister there saying, "I disagree with some of the conclusions of this report, but I take full responsibility. I disagree that any contact with the Attorney General is improper. My job is to stand up for Canadians and their interests." And he said, "I recognize that there are lessons to be learned, and this should not have happened the way it happened." He was asked whether he was going to resign or apologize. It shouldn't have happened the way that it happened, that he takes responsibility for the mistakes. "I was doing what I felt was the responsibility of the Prime Minister to defend the public interests." Again, repeating, it didn't happen the way it should. Would he fire some of those people in his office, Elder Marquez and Mathieu Bouchard? And he said, "The buck stops with the Prime Minister. I take full responsibility for what happened in my office, and I'm going to make sure that this never happens again." He was asked again, would you fire some of the people involved, including his former principal secretary, Jerry Butts, who is being brought back onto the campaign. He said Canadians will have a choice on October 21st. Also asked whether or not a deferred prosecution agreement for SNC-Lavalin is still on the table. He said that is not a decision for the Prime Minister to be made. It is a decision for the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General, David Lametti, who is replaced Jody Wilson-Raybould. Let's bring in the CBC's Power and Politics host, Vashi Capello. So what do we make of what the Prime Minister had to say?
Well, it was interesting. We had been talking right before the Prime Minister spoke about whether he would sort of unequivocally come out and say, "I was wrong and I apologize." That did not happen. Essentially, the line was that, sorry, let me just pull it up exactly, the first quote. He said, "Even though I disagree with, as you pointed out, some of his conclusions, I fully accept the report and take responsibility for what happened." Then he went on to talk at length about what happened, shouldn't have happened, and that's why they have the McClellan report. And as we had been speaking about before, the McClellan report specifically is to do with the idea of separating the Attorney General from the Justice Minister. In essence, my interpretation of what the Prime Minister was saying was the roles were confused, and that's why things unfolded the way they did, and they shouldn't have. But it's not like he was taking a lot of personal responsibility or saying, you know, I didn't live up to the ethical standards that I set out, or that my staff didn't live up to those ethical standards. And we should be clear that the Ethics Commissioner does, you know, specifically lay out 4 instances in which he says there was overreach, that the actions were inappropriate, that he did feel that the Prime Minister was directing his staff to take those actions. So he didn't really acknowledge the substance of what the Ethics Commissioner had to say there, or he sort of glossed over it and decided that what he would apologize for, or what he would acknowledge mistakes as they pertain to, was instead this idea that the two roles were conflated or confused, and that led to a lot of the sort of negative consequences or conclusions from this whole controversy. So that's what really stood out to me. There was no bare-boned, I apologize, I was wrong out of this, and instead a continued insistence that he was defending and the public interest, that he was looking out for those potential jobs. And he said he disagreed with the conclusion that the Ethics Commissioner drew on that. And I'll just read exactly what it is, because it's, accordingly, Mr. Trudeau could not properly put forward any arguments involving public or private interest to the Attorney General. The remediation agreement regime makes it clear that only the prosecutor must weigh or exclude these interests. We've heard from some lawyers who disagree with that conclusion, but what the Ethics Commissioner is saying is that the Prime Minister should never have brought those considerations to the Attorney General. The decision was supposed to be made by the prosecutor, by the Director of Public Prosecutions, by the Attorney General herself, that the Prime Minister should not have in any way gone and said, hey, these are a bunch of other things you should be considering where a DPA is concerned. And that is what the Prime Minister says he disagrees with in this report.
And just finally, Vashi, that is key, right? He said,
Yes.
I disagree that there should be that any contact with the AG is improper. And is that, just to be clear, did the Ethics Commissioner say there should be no contact whatsoever?
Well, here's what basically the paragraph in which that line that I just read out comes is after he goes over the arguments that the Prime Minister's office has made. And those are primarily around the fact that they have said this publicly, they wanted to do what they could to save the potential jobs that could be lost as a consequence of what SNC would face if they were convicted of the criminal allegations or the charges that they faced. So he lays out everything the Prime Minister says, and then he says, in my view, it remains unclear whether these factors are truly national economic interests which must be excluded from consideration or are legitimate factors that have to be weighed in deciding whether to negotiate a remediation agreement. Regardless of how such interests are classified, in this case, the larger public considerations are inextricably linked to SNC-Lavalin's private interests. So accordingly, Mr. Trudeau could not properly put forward any arguments involving public or private interests to the Attorney General. And then this goes on to say that should be left to the prosecutor. So what the Ethics Commissioner here is saying is that regardless of whether this should have been considered or shouldn't have been considered, because any considerations of how this affects the public would be linked to the private interests of SNC, the Prime Minister should not have communicated with the Attorney General. That is my interpretation of what the Ethics Commissioner lays out. As I said, we've heard from some lawyers who have a different interpretation, and we'll be talking to them later on. But obviously, the Prime Minister disagrees with that very central finding. That doesn't, however, even in the Prime Minister defending himself and saying, even if you disagree with that, the Ethics Commissioner goes on to lay out the sort of political considerations put forward by the Prime Minister and by members of his staff. And that is considered even separately. So, and he comes to some pretty damning conclusions on that end as well. So there is some wiggle room for interpretation. I understand that, but there's also a lot laid out here that goes over ethical violations, according to the Ethics Commissioner, that weren't really addressed in this press conference by the Prime Minister.
All right, Vashi, so much to go over. Thank you. That is the CBC's Vashi Capellos, host of Power and Politics. Her show begins at 5 p.m. Eastern, joining us from Ottawa. Opposition leader Andrew Scheer has accused Trudeau of using his office to reward supporters and punish critics, including Jody Wilson-Raybould. He spoke on the Commissioner's finding earlier from Regina.
This one is unforgivable. The company, which had given $100,000 in illegal donations to the Liberal Party itself, is on its own charged with defrauding some of the poorest people on earth of over $100 million. And what we have now is a clear picture of who Justin Trudeau truly is, and it's not who he promised he would be. He promised he would be accountable and ethical. Instead, time and time again, he has used the power of his office to enrich himself, reward his friends, and punish his critics. As the Ethics Commissioner notes in his report, quote, the authority of the Prime Minister and his office was used to circumvent, undermine, and ultimately discredit Jody Wilson-Raybould.
And that was Conservative leader Andrew Scheer reacting earlier. Joining me now from Ottawa Live is the CBC's Janice McGregor. So what should we make, Janice, of what Andrew Scheer had to say? And also we heard some reaction from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh.
Yeah, Andrew Scheer there laying the groundwork for why he hopes that Canadians will take from this that they cannot re-elect Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal government this fall. Trying to explain to people why, in his view, this amounts to a guilty verdict on their conduct in this affair. And interesting, he was asked whether he believes that there's enough here for an obstruction of justice case as pertains to their interactions with SNC-Lavalin and what they were allegedly trying to do in terms of influencing the eventual criminal prosecution of this company. And Scheer today said, yes, he does think that in this report there is enough evidence of that. I want to say, though, as I've kept reading this report, I've been trying to see kind of what points Scheer would have found that would have led him to conclude that. There is an interesting paragraph near the end, sort of when Mr. Dion is kind of wrapping up and making his main arguments. I think it's important to note. It says, this is Dion writing now, the fact that Ms. Wilson-Raybould was not directed to intervene likely prevented the occurrence of actual political interference in the matter. But it does little to assist Mr. Trudeau in this examination, which of course is not a criminal examination, but an ethical one. And the repeated interventions by the Prime Minister, his most senior ministerial staff and public officials to have the Attorney General find a solution, even in the face of her refusal to intervene in this matter, leading me to conclude that these actions were tantamount to political direction. So whether this is ultimately a matter of criminal obstruction of justice, or whether it's just something that's going to play out in the court of public opinion, which was very much Mr. Scheer's point today. You know, either way, Canadians have to consider these new things brought forward today and make their choice. Now, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was on the West Coast today. He reacted quite a bit earlier to what the report was saying. Let's take a listen.
This matter, whether we have the Conservatives or Liberals in power, both of them seem to have this track record where they don't get that their job is to work for people, not for the people at the very top. And they're not working for the benefits of everyday families, they're working to make it easier for the multimillionaires, and that's really what I think is at the heart of this matter.
They're wanting Canadians to know, progressive voters in particular, to know that if they are not happy with the Liberal government's conduct, they do have another choice, that being his government. Important to note, I think also, you know, you heard him sort of trying to portray the Liberal government as cozy with this corporation. This report goes through and emphasizes that there were financial considerations for SNC-Lavalin in this, and then documents how there were repeated interactions with senior staff, with SNC-Lavalin lawyers and key personnel at the same time as they were having these conversations with Jody Wilson-Raybould and her staff, trying to figure out why they were determined not to intervene in this case. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, that is kind of the most damaging impression you take away from this report, that on the one hand, they're saying, well, we didn't want to interfere. On the other hand, they're still very much engaged in this company and very open to hearing the company's arguments about what it wants the government to do.
And then, Janice, as if all of this is not enough, we have Anne McClellan, the former Liberal cabinet minister, former Justice Minister, Attorney General, who was tasked with trying to figure out whether or not those two roles, Attorney General and Justice Minister, if they should be separated. It shouldn't be one person. And that report came out to the public, at least today, and the Prime Minister was asked about that.
Yeah, lots of reading for everyone this afternoon. Speed reading, that's what we do here in Ottawa. Listen, I was having flashbacks to the Prime Minister's news conference last spring when he first kind of proposed that McClellan was going to look into this issue, because that news conference was very much about treating this as a learning opportunity. We're going to take a look at this. We're going to examine, you know, the opportunities for education here to figure out what went wrong. That was still very much the message track we heard from Justin Trudeau this afternoon in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I felt this was very much taking responsibility, yes, but trying to frame this as we can do better, we can learn from this. But McClellan, yes, not recommending that the two roles, Attorney General and Minister of Justice, be split, saying that she doesn't see further structural change being necessary. But she is framing what needs to be done very much in terms of education, clarification, so that senior staff know more of what's appropriate and what isn't in terms of interference in prosecutions. Also recommending changing the name of the department to make it clear that the Attorney General is right up there front and center, recommending that the oath of office for this job be changed. But I think the most important thing that she's pointing out is that in her view, it should be clear that the Attorney General may issue directives or take over prosecution on public interest grounds, or because there's a no reasonable prospect of conviction. This, I think, is really key, because here is McClellan saying, look, The Attorney General needs to know that it's okay for him or her to get involved in a case when there is a public interest argument to be made. That is actually exactly what Trudeau and his people are saying here, that Jody Wilson-Raybould should have gotten involved because there was a public interest issue at play in this prosecution. Jody Wilson-Raybould felt otherwise, that to do anything would be inappropriate. McClellan, in this aspect, definitely siding with the government.
Janice, thank you. That is the CBC's Janice McGregor live in Ottawa. All right, we're going to bring back our panel. My next guests who have been here throughout this afternoon and have been watching with interest: Omar Khan, Vice President of Public Affairs at Hill and Knowlton. He previously served as Chief of Staff in several provincial Liberal ministerial offices. Shakir Chambers, Senior Consultant at Navigator, and previously he helped craft the Ontario PC platform during the Doug Ford campaign, and of course our Hannah Thibedeau. So Omar, let's start off with you. What is your reaction to what the Prime Minister had to say with regard to this Ethics Commissioner's report finding him to have contravened the Conflict of Interest Act?
Well, I think he stated again, as he did before, that clearly something went off the rails here, right? Something was not, things could have been done differently, and they should have been done differently. But my God, my head is hurting from all of those legal arguments back and forth, and Attorney General versus Minister of Justice. And I've worked in government for 10 years, including for an Attorney General. So can you just imagine the general public out there? I think that's why it's really important to take a look at Anne McClellan's report today. There needs to be a clear differentiation between the two roles, and whether or not they're separated or not, we all have opinions on that. But my God, can you imagine in the heat of the moment when you're trying to make decisions that have an impact potentially on thousands of people's livelihoods? It's very confusing, and it's what appears to me that has happened here is that there's been a lot that there was confusion on the role of the Attorney General, that specific non-political role versus the other role that Jody Wilson-Raybould held, which was as a political cabinet minister, the Minister of Justice. It was confusing. People perhaps should have had better clarity, a better understanding around where one role ends and the other one begins. And I think Ms. McClellan has given a decent roadmap on at least some ways to move forward in trying to address that.
And Shakir, what did you think of the Prime Minister's response to this? He said the buck stops with him. He didn't seem like he was going to get rid of the staff who were named in this report as well, but also he wouldn't apologize. Do you think it's enough because he said he was trying to protect jobs?
So I guess what I don't understand is the Prime Minister takes responsibility. He knows he made a mistake. He knows he can do things differently. If that's the case, apologize for your wrongdoings. Acknowledge that you did things wrong, move forward and do things differently, and I agree with that. He's not going to fire any staff. I understand that, but I think come October 21st, Canadians will probably fire him for his behavior, right? So I think there's going to be a choice to be made, as he laid out very clearly. The election's coming. It's a battle of ideas between Andrew Scheer, Justin Trudeau. We'll see what happens on October 21st. But I think the Prime Minister needs to acknowledge that he did Justin Raybould wrong. There's been great political damage done to her, great consequences done to her. I think he needs to acknowledge that, say he's sorry to her, and say he's sorry to Canadians for his behavior.
Omar, I want to ask you about that because we know Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, they're no longer cabinet ministers, they're no longer in the Liberal caucus. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, well, the reason they were kicked out of the Liberal caucus through a vote of the Liberal caucus was because they were divulging caucus confidences.
It wasn't a vote. It was the Prime Minister had spoken with the different regions and they had suggested
there was a collective decision made at caucus.
The Prime Minister was the one that decided that.
There was a collective decision made at caucus. We can go back and review the transcript, but there was a collective decision made at caucus, and it was because they were divulging caucus confidences, which is not something we do in our system. But look, you make a good point. There is an election coming up, and Canadians will have an opportunity to decide who they want to lead. And it's a clear choice, right? So like I said earlier, there's only going to be two people on the ballot who have the opportunity to become the Prime Minister of this country. That's Andrew Scheer or Justin Trudeau. And what the Prime Minister has said before is, of course, everyone is human. People make mistakes. But ultimately, this comes down to a difference of visions. And there's one vision that focuses on lifting hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty and into the middle class. There's a vision that wants to take a global leadership role on fighting climate change. And then there's another revision that wants to take us back to the days of Stephen Harper, where, quite frankly, Canada was not playing a leading role in climate change. The values of that government was soundly rejected coast to coast in the last election, and there will be an opportunity for Canadians to make that decision.
And there's no question that we will be talking about those important issues today. The news is that, there was this big scandal, right, Shakir, in terms of went on for a couple of months, and maybe Canadians have made their own determinations about that, or maybe this will change their minds. We'll wait and see. But is the difference here that up until now, an independent commissioner had not ruled on whether or not the Prime Minister broke the law? Today, the Ethics Commissioner did and said the Prime Minister did break the law. He did. There was a conflict of interest, a contravention that took place. So were you surprised at how he reacted today? Because it sounded quite similar to how he reacted months ago.
I wasn't surprised by the Prime Minister's reaction. I mean, this is typical of Mr. Trudeau, right? He's never going to admit his wrongdoing. He's never going to say he's sorry for his actions. But the problem is he says he doesn't want to make the same mistakes again. At the core of this issue is that he violated ethics rules. It was an ethics violation. This is the second time he's done this, right? So saying you're not going to make the same mistakes again is falling on deaf ears. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is a guy who's going to make promises and not deliver on his promises. As I've said before, he campaigned on being transparent, being ethical. Talking about transparency, cabinet confidence. He said on the matter of cabinet confidence, he didn't want to reveal too much because the people that were involved in this are less relevant issues or less relevant actors. If that's actually the case, why not allow the Ethics Commissioner to investigate and do his job? Right? What is there to hide?
So, Omar, and what about that point? As Andrew Scheer was bringing up earlier, this is the first Prime Minister, not once but twice, to be found to have contravened these ethics breaches. And so Canadians are going to say, wait a second, can we trust you? Can we trust you to lead the country if you're breaking the rules?
Well, look, I think everybody makes mistakes and everybody is human. I think Canadians will judge the Prime Minister and other political leaders on how they react and how they move forward from these issues. We'll go back to promises, Captain, promises made. One of the first things this government did was implement an election promise that called for raising taxes on the 1% slightly so that everybody else could pay a lot less. And, I think juxtaposing that vision that's focused on benefiting the middle class of this country versus what we're seeing from other conservative provincial governments across this country, cuts to autism services, cuts to education services, I think that's going to be a fairly clear choice come election day for Canadians.
So, go ahead.
We can sit here and we could try to change the dial. The core issue right now is he was found in violation of the ethics rules. He's the first Prime Minister to be found in violation twice. In 4 years, he's been found in violation twice. There's something to be said about that, right? For sure,
and it is absolutely not an ideal situation. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat it. But for me, and I'm a firm believer that Canadians understand that everyone is human, including their Prime Minister and including their leaders.
Everyone is human, but the Prime Minister is held to a higher standard.
100%. And people make mistakes. It's how you react and move on from those mistakes, and what changes do you implement to make sure that those mistakes don't happen again.
And he can start with an apology. That would be the first step. To say he's wrong, he made a mistake, I think that's a great step forward.
I think what he said today is quite clear, that things should have been different, and he's going to make the changes necessary to make sure that this does not happen again.
Omar, but he didn't apologize, right? He said, I can't apologize for standing up for Canadian jobs. He made a point not to say the words, I'm sorry, and not to apologize.
The number one, job description of any member of Parliament, be it the Prime Minister or a backbencher, is to fight for jobs in your community. That's not something that I personally would ever apologize myself either for.
Shakir, looking forward, how big, we're 10 weeks until Election Day, how big of a focus do you think the Conservatives will maintain on this SNC-Lavalin ethics breach?
I think there's going to be a focus on the campaign because this is a broader narrative of can you trust Justin Trudeau? Is Justin Trudeau someone that's going to deliver on his campaign promises? And I think the answer is going to be no. We need to remind Canadians, again, this is not the first time, this is the second time of ethics violations, and they need to understand he's campaigning on ethics, he's campaigning on accountability, he's campaigning on transparency, but he's shown over the last 4 years that he just won't deliver. He is not as he's advertising himself to be, and I think Canadians now are realizing that, and we'll see what happens come October 21st.
Except the first thing he did was deliver an across-the-board income tax cut for...
He also campaigned on electoral reform. He didn't deliver on that, did he?
Well, look, we can get into the nuances of whether or not there was... 100%. We can get into the nuances of whether or not there was obstruction at committees and whatnot. But, you know, every government, every party runs on a platform, and you do your best to try and implement the core elements of that platform. And the first thing this government did was raise taxes on the 1% by just a little bit, so that everyone else, probably you and I and everyone on this table, can pay a lot less. And that's, I think, one of the things that the Canadians are going to judge him on. And ask Andrew Scheer, you know, what are your priorities?
Omar, when you look at the polls back in April when the scandal first hit, and every time it was spoken about, you could see that the Liberals were bleeding numbers.
Yeah.
So you're 10 weeks to Election Day. How does the Liberal Party ensure that those numbers don't go down again?
So, like I said earlier, I suspect that a lot of this is baked in to the electoral calculus now that Canadians have made in their minds. This issue, you know, I was on these panels almost daily for a month or even more. You know, I don't think there's a Canadian out there who hasn't heard about this, right? It is all out there. I think what is going to be important for the Prime Minister and the Liberal team now is to really pivot and talk about the choice that Canadians face. It's choice A or B. It's Scheer or Trudeau. And like I said,
you can hear those lines already
well,
now.
on the one hand, like I said, I'll say it again. You have a Prime Minister who has been aggressive in fighting climate change, on putting a price on pollution, on taking money from polluters and putting it back into the pockets of Canadians, who's lifted hundreds of thousands of Canadians out of poverty. And you have Andrew Scheer, who's aligned himself with Jason Kenney and Doug Ford. People can decide.
All right. This was great. Thank you both very much. That was Omar Khan, Vice President of Public Affairs at Hill and Knowlton, and Shakir Chambers, Senior Consultant with Navigator, and Hannah Thibodeau, of course, here with me. So much more still ahead on today's breaking news. Canada's Ethics Commissioner says that the Prime Minister broke the Ethics Act during the SNC-Lavalin affair. The very latest on the story just ahead on CBC News Network.